All right, everyone. Just like mentioned, today we're going to cover JavaScript and Jest. We're also going to do an introduction to test-driven development. We're going to go through all the fundamentals of JavaScript, not exactly all of them. We're going to cover the surface level, and I'm going to provide a lot of sources in our notes that you can utilize to figure out different static methods depending on which data type you're working with. And we'll dive into functions, intermediate JavaScript, and then we'll go into how install Jest and writing our first test. But before we do any of that, let's go ahead and start our lecture with something somewhat fun and a light introduction to JavaScript for those of you who don't have any sort of exposure to JavaScript. Today will be the day that you will master and conquer 25% of the realm of JavaScript.
JavaScript, an embarrassing toy language used exclusively to build things it's not supposed to. It was created by Brendan Eich in 1995, who was given requirements to build a language like Java, but for it only took him 7 days to execute flawlessly. It became an overnight dumpster fire, but shit really hit the fan in 2005 when Ryan Dahl made the epic mistake of bringing JavaScript to the server with Node.js. Just like Alfred Nobel and Dynamite, he would go on to apologize for his invention many years later.
And it's my fault, and I'm very sorry.
The language is designed for only one use case, to annoy people with browser pop-ups. But today, it's used to build memory-hogging desktop apps with Electron, janky mobile apps with React Native, and unreliable APIs with Express.js. No matter what you're trying to build, there are hundreds of different game-changing next-gen libraries to get the job done. That's because whenever a JavaScript developer encounters a problem, it will instinctively create a brand new framework and upload it to GitHub with a bunch of emojis in the README. In fact, there are so many NPM packages that Al Gore is now predicting the Arctic will be ice-free by 2013.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood.
Unlike languages people actually like, JavaScript doesn't have a mascot, but they are working with David Cronenberg to design one. It's a loosely typed language, and by that, I mean completely detached from reality. When you add an array to an object, obviously it returns a string that says object. Now switch the order of the operands, and predictably it returns 0. If you want a good laugh for yourself, try adding two objects together. You'll get object. Now with that knowledge, what do you think two arrays will equal? Obviously an empty string. That makes total sense because the number 0 is equivalent to an empty array, and also equivalent to a string of 0. And that means the only possible sane conclusion is that a string of 0 is also equivalent to an empty array. But amazingly, it's not.
Everybody knows you never go full retard.
It got this way because Netscape did a focus group in the 90s with some homeless web developers they found on the street who thought 2 plus 2 should equal 22. And of course, that's why 2 minus 2 equals 0. When a language is this bad and this popular at the same time, it creates an ecosystem where libraries like isOdd, which does exactly what the name implies, can get over 400,000 downloads per week. The fun thing about packages is that there's multiple module systems like CommonJS and ESM, so you never know if the package you're installing is actually going to work. Now, if you do manage to build something with JavaScript, it'll probably never see the light of day because then you have to learn module bundling with a tool like Webpack, and it's just not worth it, man. This has been my cathartic release from over 10 years of JavaScript development. Despite its problems, it's evolved into an awesome language in 2022, and I love programming with it. Today is Thanksgiving, and I'm extremely thankful for JavaScript because it puts food on my family. If you want to master the basics, all this
Awesome. So that's our quick introduction to JavaScript, a little attention getter there before we start diving into our actual content for the day. JavaScript is somewhat of a pain to completely deal with because of the fact that it's loosely typed, just like mentioned. There is a lot of examples where things that you wouldn't expect to work for whatever reason do work. And although you may think that that's fantastic because you'll learn into less errors, it's actually quite the opposite. It's a huge problem because JavaScript allows you to do things that you don't necessarily want to do. So sometimes when you really need an error to be thrown, it won't throw the error, and instead it'll do something that you completely didn't intend for it to do. So with that said, you have to be very careful when you're writing in JavaScript code, and you have to just consistently run your code to make sure it's doing what you need it to do. So that was a quick little introduction into JavaScript. JavaScript is still a fantastic language, and as they mentioned, it is now both in the client and the server side. Here in Code Platoon, we're mainly going to use it on the client side. So let's talk about why we're utilizing JavaScript and how this runs. So the internet, the way it works, whenever we log into something or someone is using an application, that application can exist in multiple different interfaces or user interfaces. For example, currently right now I'm using my laptop. I could log into Zoom utilizing my phone, or I could bring in another laptop and have the same exact Zoom room opened up in all three laptops, or the same exact application opened up in all three laptops. They may not be handling the same information, but the same user interface can be applied in all three of those devices. Now, when I'm applying that user interface to all three of those devices, what's happening? Well, first of all, that user interface is written in JavaScript, majority of the time. Now, why would that be a thing? Well, that's because JavaScript has been adopted by all of the popular browsers nowadays. And JavaScript is actually one of the only languages that you could truly run in the browser. As you can see here, if I can go to my inspector tools, I can come over to the console and I can actually write JavaScript code here. And it would work perfectly fine because my browser is actually supporting JavaScript code, and it's usually to interpret it in runtime. But we'll go into how this is actually working under the hood later on once we're talking about React. But that's not where it all ends, right? Not only can I write my entire user interface in JavaScript, but this communication here, where a client is able to log in and send a request to a server and expect a response, that's actually all happening in JSON. Now, JSON is just JavaScript and objects, but I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to dive into what JSON means and everything about JSON until we start talking about API requests. Now, it returns a massive object that we can iterate with and is compatible with the language of JavaScript. And an example of this, we're going to see this many times throughout the cohort, is a Poke API. Yes, I do like Pokemon, so I am a huge fan of this API here. Now, an API is an application performance interface, and that's what allows us to share data between the server and our actual clients. Every single time you press a button or every single time you log into an application, so for example, Instagram, I open up Instagram, an authentication token gets sent to the server. The server says, oh, I know who this is because it queries the database. And then there's some sort of API view, which we'll go into later on. Just keep those terminologies in the back of your head, that goes and queries the database, grabs the last 20 posts that pertain to me that would be most relatable to my feed, and then that comes back to the client side in JSON to include an image URL, to include body of text that would show up, the number of likes, the comments that belong to each one of those posts, and that's what loads into my user interface on my phone. This is an example of it. Not this. This is a pop-up because JavaScript. All right. This is an example of it. If I were to send a request for information about the Pokemon Ditto through my JavaScript code to this server or this API that's being hosted in some server, the API would respond with an object in JavaScript that would have key value pairs to different sets of data. Again, this is a huge dive into everything that will be pretty much opening up as a Russian doll later on in these next couple of weeks. But this is just a quick overview over how the internet works and why JavaScript is so important in nowadays. Does anyone have any questions about that topic? Perfect. If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and continue pushing forward. Again, just a friendly reminder, if you do not ask questions or let me know that I am going too fast, I will not slow down nor understand what needs to be reiterated. I can't speak. What needs to go over again. So please just make sure that you are asking questions and letting me know if I'm just going extremely fast. All right. Now, we went over InstallFest. Once we complete InstallFest, we have something called Node being installed into our machine. Node can actually run into the terminal and open up a REPL. Now, this REPL is essentially just a script that will actually run JavaScript code for us. And all I need to do to open that up in the terminal is type in Node. Once I type in Node, you'll notice that my terminal changes. This arrow bracket means I am now writing JavaScript code. Just like I did inside of the Chrome browser, I can write console.log and say hello and actually get a return statement of hello. I can do something like 2 plus 2 for mathematical operators, and it would still give me a return value. Now, in order to exit this script, all I would do is press period, exit, and that will allow me to exit back into my regular code. Now, this is not occupying any sort of memory space inside of my machine. The moment I click exit, everything gets dumped, the garbage gets collected and goes away. For those of you who may be used to computer science terminology, where you won't have to worry about garbage collection with either of the languages that we're going to be utilizing. Now, here, once I click exit, this is gone. So then the question that you may have is, what's the benefit to having a node terminal or a REPL being opened up if all of it's going to disappear? I personally use it in case I want to try out code. Maybe I just want to see how a string would respond, or I want to remind myself how to utilize a spread operator. This is where I would come into experiment, maybe create a dummy data structure or just copy something from an actual script, paste it in there, work with it, try to manipulate it, try a couple of things. And then once I understand what I'm trying to do, I would start writing it into my script. That's the way I utilize it, and it's the way I mostly recommend to use this for your benefit. Go ahead, Alex.
How would you do multiple lines of code? Like if you wanted to do a for loop over multiple different lines in the terminal node thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you do a for I, let I be equal to 0, and then we will be covering this shortly, so please don't worry too much about this. Let's see, if I is less than 10, then I plus plus. When I click enter here, it's going to recognize the for loop and the fact that you have an open bracket. That open bracket is going to let it know that you still have a body. So now I can go ahead and console.log I can come down and then close my loop. The
So
moment
no hotkey, it should just recognize it.
that's correct. No hotkey, it will recognize it. And the moment I close it, that's what actually closes my loop and executes that block of code. Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Andy?
Is there a storage while you're doing the coding in terminal, or is that once you execute, is that the only thing that's stored, or it doesn't get stored, it just executes and that's it?
While you're inside of this node terminal, it is being stored as far as data goes. The moment you exit, all of it gets thrown away. Awesome. Any other questions?
So since it's all being collectively stored within that terminal for that session, is there a way to, I guess, undo a line that you decide you don't need anymore if you're using it to whiteboard?
Not from my knowledge. As far as that's the downside to utilizing a REPL is you are very limited to how you can work it or the many different functionalities are inside of it, right? It's more of a preview thing, something that you can do, short experimentation, not for you to actually execute an entire coding assignment on. Does that answer your question, Justin?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, awesome. All right, so that is Node in the terminal. But we are not going to be utilizing Node in the terminal all the time because just like I said, we don't actually want to write entire scripts in there. Instead, we have actual script tags. So here I'm going to have main.js. This is where I'm going to be writing all of my JavaScript code. Put this to the side. All right. And inside here, well, the first thing we're going to be covering is going to be our variables. Now, variables are very straightforward. They're essentially just something that you can store information into so that you can reference it later on. For example, if I wanted to have 10, but I wanted to be able to reference it later on as something that I can, maybe it's my number of apples. Maybe I'm working with an algorithm that's just saying, hey, solve the number of apples after you take away 2, all right? And here, I could just reference or write the number 10, but that's not getting saved anywhere. Once that line of executable code 10 passes by, 10 no longer exists. So how do I fix that? The way I fix it is by actually storing it inside of a variable. I can say let my number of apples be equal to 10. And now, regardless of how many lines I pass by, there is always going to be stored in memory. And it will be not always, as long as the script lives. I apologize. As long as the script lives, this will be stored in memory. And I can reference it by the variable my number of apples. Now, a couple of things to notice about this variable. Starts in lowercase. And you'll notice that instead of writing spaces, I'm actually utilizing something called camel casing. That means every new word is starting with an uppercase letter. And later on in Python, we're going to utilize something called snake casing. Now, these naming conventions are just standard. They're not something that's going to be enforced. It's not going to throw an error if you try to break your naming conventions. So if I try to do snake casing here, it's not going to tell me, hey, you can't have this inside of your variable name. I can definitely do something like that. This is just the standard norm as to how JavaScript developers write code whenever they're referencing a variable, always in camel casing. And then Python developers, whenever they're writing code, snake casing is going to be the way to write your variables. One last thing regarding variables. Variables can hold any data type, meaning that we can also have my string holding a string saying like, hello, this is me. We can also have, we already went over numbers, we went over string, say let is truth be equal to true, which could be holding something like a Boolean variable. All right. Variables can hold any sort of either primitive or complex data type inside of it. It is just simply a box. I'm saying, hey, I want you to store this information inside of this box. So I can grab this box out of storage later on and maybe manipulate the information that is inside of it. You'll notice that I'm utilizing let to establish all of these. When JavaScript was first created, there was a variable named var that you can use to actually establish these variables. At this point in time, it's now considered deprecated, and it's not really utilized. Deprecated. Let's go with that. There you go. Now, the reason why it's been deprecated, it has to do with scope. We're not going to dive too far into why var got deprecated. I just want everyone to know that it's no longer utilized and it's not common to still use in today's day and age whenever you're establishing a variable. Now, another way to establish a variable is by writing const. The difference between let and const is let, so let versus const. Let is a variable that can be reassigned or manipulated while const means its value is permanent. Probably not going to learn how to spell that today. Close enough. It's permanent and should not be changed. The only way that I would be able to change something like this is by creating a copy and storing it under a different variable. Notice that I'm not actually mutating or changing the data that is under const, right? I'm just simply creating a copy and storing it under a different variable. But anything that is created in const is something that should remain untouched for the remaining of the program. And that's it. That's the quick overview regarding variables. Does anyone have any questions about that? Perfect. So let's start talking about some data types. There's primitive data types and complex data types. Primitive data types are strings, booleans, and undefined and null. There's also numbers in there, which it looks like we missed that portion to place that in there. So let's start talking about it. We already have a string here, so I'm just going to move that down and start interacting with strings. Now, inside of strings, something to note here is that strings are immutable. Well, what does that mean? The first time I ever heard this term, immutable, as badly as it sounds, the first thing that went through my head was mute, like the mute button on the remote, right? Like if I want to mute the TV, but it actually means something like mutant, right? Like the way I started thinking about it is like the X-Men or Marvel, right? We have mutants in there, things that can be altered or that have the ability to change. So mutable means it's something I can change, something I can interact with and change its original value without having to recreate an entire new copy of it or change the value of the actual variable. Now, an immutable data structure is something that will not change. Hello, this is me. Once it's been created, although I can interact with it and access each one of those values at its independent index, cannot change. I can reassign the variable of my string to a value similar or a slice of the string, but the string itself never changed. I just simply dumped it outside of my ability to be able to access it. So make sure that you have that in mind whenever you're working with string algorithms. Strings are immutable data structures, meaning they cannot be mutated or its original value cannot be changed. I saw a hand go up. I believe that was Andy.
Yeah, it was just how you use them, how you move the line down, but I got it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Dallas?
Yes, for the const, is that the same exact thing as immutable? How you define it up there?
So kind of, yes. Whenever you make something const, you're essentially saying that it can't be changed. But that would make the variable immutable, not the data structure, right? So the string is now immutable, not the variable. Does that answer your question, Dallas?
Probably does. I just probably have another question upon that to understand it more. But yeah, I think I understand what you mean.
Okay, perfect. We'll break it down here in a couple of examples as we continue moving forward. All right. So let's start talking about strings a little bit more. Now, strings, the way I like to think about them is each one of them have their own independent memory address, right? It kind of works like an array. It's still just a train of a stack. The moment the quotation starts, each one of those letters is allotted an index or a spot. It's not an actual just string or just one single line. Instead, it's little blocks of lines that are being stored to include spaces and special characters. So if I were to take a look at that, I see hello, this is me. Well, I can console log my string at index 0. And now if I run node main.js, it'll execute my script and show me the letter H. Why is it showing me the letter H? Can somebody break that down for me?
The index 0. So basically all strings and stuff like that start lists as well. Strings in this case start at index 0 and count up going to the right. So 0 is technically H.
Perfect. All right, so we'll leave it at there at 9. But there you can see how each one of the indexes correlate to one spot of the letters. Just like we said here, each one of them have their own independent box inside of that train cart. Well, 0 belongs to the letter H. So if I were to go with something like the number 6 and then execute it, what would that return?
T.
G.
Yeah, it would return the T. Because that's what matches here as far as index goes. Great. Now there is a couple of other things that go into string. String can be written with double quotation marks, or it can actually be written with single quotation marks. Oh, hello. Now, what would be the problem with utilizing something like single quotation marks?
If you need one inside your string, then it's going to escape it and throw an error if you try to run it like that.
Exactly. So if I try to do something like it is, well, now I just have a weird string that says, hello, this is me, it. The string ends, and then I have a character for S that is never referenced or established in memory. And then I start a new string. And that's why strings are immutable is now orange. Now, something that Nick said or Nick stated was that I could escape the character. To escape characters, all I need to do is add a backslash. And that would escape the character so that I can still see my string. But to avoid all of this hassle of making sure that I have a backslash in my character, or that I have a backslash to be able to escape that second quotation mark there, I always recommend that when you start a string, you utilize double quotation marks. Now, there is something called my interpolated string. So let interpolated string. An interpolated string works with backticks. What this allows us to do is actually write JavaScript within the string. So I can write functions like mathematical operations here. I can say the sum is, and by adding a $sign and curly brackets, I can actually write some JavaScript code. So I can say 4 plus 4. And if I go into logging this into my console, you'll notice that it returns 8. Even though I have 4 plus 4 in there, it was actually able to execute the code, grab its return value, and insert it as string. String can be added together as well. I can say hello plus a space plus this is me. And when I execute this, I just get one single string saying, hello, this is me, accounting for that space. All right, does anyone have any questions about strings? Let's hear it, Carlos.
All right, so when you're doing the braces, can you assign a value like within the braces? Can you assign a value to a variable and then reference that same variable further on in that string? Or do
So
you need to assign that value before you get into that interpolated string?
the value would have to be assigned before. So for example, let my number of apples already exist. I can just say num of apples or my num of apples. Let me
Okay, so basically it's just whatever it's executing within those braces just kind of stays within the braces. It doesn't really, it doesn't exist outside of those braces.
Right. You can't do
Okay,
something variable assignment inside of a interpolated string. Of
gotcha. Okay, thanks.
course. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Alex.
So if you reassign my number of apples later, and then you call and then you say print the string after before and after you reassign it, it would say different things.
Let's see. Let's go into my number of apples, and let's make it 5 this time. Right? It still says the sum is 10. That's because this is runtime language, right? Meaning it starts from top to bottom. At the moment that line 16 gets executed, my number of apples value is only 10. So even though later on I assigned it to the number of 5, this line 16 has already been executed, meaning my interpolation has already been assigned to the value of 10. Even though I changed the number of apples, when I logged the value stored inside of the variable interpolated string, the value 10 is what got stored inside of this string. If I wanted to reassign it, I would have to reassign or recall this interpolated string all over again. Does that answer your question?
So to recall that, would you just type interpolated string, like the name of the variable, or the name of the interpolated string after my number of apples?
Yeah. So I would just say interpolated string equal to, and then say new num, and then pass in my number of apples.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then let's see it at 2 separate phases here. Actually, there you go. So there you can see the sum is 10. All right, then we reassign the value to the interpolated string. There's a new value for my number of apples. So now that's evaluates to 5. And when we log it to the console for the second time, then we get the number 5. All right, any other questions? Perfect.
Sorry, real quick. Can
Yeah.
you do like an if statement within the braces, or are you limited to certain, I guess, functions within the braces?
You can. Could you bring that question up again once we make it to intermediate JavaScript? That way I could go over ternary statements.
If I remember.
All right, let me write it down here in the Avenger questions, so hopefully we won't forget. Ternary statements within interpolated strings. All right, awesome. So now this doesn't stop here, right? This is just the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to strings. Here in our notes, I actually attached a, oh no, went to the wrong tab. Bring it back. There it is. I actually attached a couple of links that will send us to all the different string methods. So this sends us to the W3 strings. And if we come over to string methods, it goes over all the static methods that belong to strings, such as getting the length of a string that comes back in numbers. We can figure out what the character is that's located at index 0. This one returns UTF code. There's quite a bit of string methods out there, such as slice, which will allow us to actually slice down a string, right? So if we go to try it yourself, it's going to let you do a little bit of a playground here so you can see what that looks like and how it works. I strongly recommend that once this class is over, if JavaScript is new to you, or even if you are or you feel like you're already pretty competent in JavaScript, take a look at these examples and all the different static methods that are in here. I promise you that there's got to be at least one method in here that you haven't seen before, or that you probably hard coded in the past, where you may created an entire function to be able to accomplish what just one method is already programmed to do for you. All right, before we move on into numbers, does anyone have any leftover questions regarding strings? Let's hear it, Daniel.
Is there a function to see where the string is in memory? So like I know in C you could like always look up the initial value of that string and it'll tell you like the memory code where it's at. Is there a functionality in JavaScript that's the same way?
I believe there is. I just don't know it off the top of my head. I apologize. I'd have to find it later on and then send it your way. Could you post that question inside of the Avenger questions? That way I can make sure that gets answered.
Will do. Thank you.
Dallas?
I know there are differences between data types between the languages, especially how you execute them. Python is my only language of reference I have besides JavaScript. Are the strings different between those two languages much at all for how they work?
So they are different in the sense that the way you write them and the way they're read, they're very similar both in JavaScript and Python, but their limitations are not the same. So for example, in Python, if I tried to add an integer to a string, I would get an error saying, hey, you can't do this. This is an integer. You need to either convert it or convert the string into something else or write it as an interpolated string to be able to make that happen, right? In JavaScript, that is not the case. In JavaScript, I can multiply and add string times numbers, and it would actually return a value. So the way it behaves as far as an execution or the capabilities and limitations that it has are way more open than they are in Python. That's why it's a loosely typed language. Does that answer your question, Dallas?
Yes, sir.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and move on into numbers. So numbers are pretty straightforward. Let me go ahead and comment out this code here. So numbers are pretty straightforward. If I go into create a number can be positive in nature. I can also have something like a negative number. And that is still considered just a number. And I can also have something like a decimal. And this as well also falls as a number. Now, something that is very commonly used is math to interact with numbers. Math will allow us to conduct a couple of different, I guess, standard mathematical operations. It's like, and I don't need to import it or anything like that. I can just call math. It already belongs and is inside of JavaScript, pretty much built in. And it comes with a bunch of functions inside of it. I can grab the max from an array. If I have an array of numbers, I can return which one is the biggest one. I can return which one is the smallest one. I can round, and I can also create random numbers. I also have something like pow. And what pow does is something like 3 to the power of 2. If I go and log this to the console, it would actually return 9. Let's take a look at some mathematical operators as well. Come on. There it is. For mathematical operators, we can just simply do addition. We can do subtraction. There's some multiplication. We can also accomplish this power, or excuse me, this pow by doing something like 3 times 3. Oh, to the power of 3. There you go, to the power of 2. There you go, and that will still return 9, right? Let's see what else we have here. We have division. So if I do 3 divided by 2, we expect that to return 1.5. I believe we could do, we can't do floor division. So there's something that happens there. If I wanted to do something like floor division and actually return the floor number, I can do something like math.floor. And then do 3 divided by 2. And that would return 1. Just like there's something like floor, I can also do seal. That would return 2. Or even better, I can just round. And that would also return 2. Modulus is a good one. What modulus does is it actually returns the remainder. So if I do something like 3 modulus 2, I expect it to return, I believe it would be 0.5. 1. I apologize. So returns 1. Because 3 divided by 2, so 1 goes into 2 one time, but then there's 1 left over, so it returns 1. Again, if I do something like 15 and 7, that should also return 1. Right? Because 7 goes into 15 2 times, and there's just a remainder of 1. This is a good way to find out if something is odd or isn't odd. Then there's also incrementation. So for example, if I do my num plus plus, oh, excuse me. It has to happen before I log it onto the console. Otherwise, it would be assignment. So this actually does variable reassignment. And increments the original value.
Does that mean if you put my num plus plus inside the console log statement, it's going to give you 10 because that's what it currently, or actually in this case it'd give you 11, and then afterwards would it give you 12? Because it was 10, you added 1 in line 25, so right now if you run it, it'll print 11, right?
Correct.
And now after the console log, would you console log my num again?
It
But
should
go to
only give you 11 because it's not assigning that to the variable again.
do plus plus. Does it not do it inside the statement?
So that's a great question. And let's go ahead and operate that.
It does do it.
Still works. It
It
does.
just it prints it before it does it, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
It will conduct the current value and then the function. All right. So there's our ability to increment, but I can also decrement. Hello. You'll see that that returns 9. Fantastic. All right. Now, just like before, there are other things that we can do with numbers. There are some methods here that you can go ahead and utilize to interact with. This 2 precision one is really good whenever you're working with decimals, especially large decimal numbers. You'll notice that large decimal numbers start acting a little bit crazy inside of JavaScript. They'll start returning exponential expressions. I believe that's the correct term. They'll start returning exponential expressions to actually show you how far the decimal number goes. So just to prevent that from happening, that 2 precision method is actually really useful. All right. And that is it for numbers, everyone. Does anyone have any questions regarding numbers before we continue? Go ahead, Alex.
So it says 2 precision returns a number with a specified length. So you do 2 precision and then do 5 within the parentheses, or is the specified length like coded in?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and go down there. All right. So 2 precision, currently X is 9.656. The first time it gets ran, this would assume 0 or 1, excuse me. So it would go 9.6 and stop there. If you do 2, then it will show us 9.65. 4 would actually continue the iteration because it goes past those 3 digits, right? And it would start generating the rest of this decimal point. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Michael?
Does JavaScript use stuff like floats as well, like similar to Python?
It does not. It just falls under a number.
Okay, simple.
All right. Any other questions? I'm seeing some questions in the Avenger channel. Let me go ahead and make sure that these questions are being addressed. All right, and then posting the Zoom chat, Shift Alt up and down. Are these just my keyboard shortcuts, Gary?
What was that?
These just keyboard shortcuts?
Yeah,
Okay,
I use those all the time, so just thought I'd share.
easy peasy. All right, so that's going to go ahead and conclude our numbers portion. We have a hot mic. Let me go ahead and take care of that. Done. Let's start talking about Booleans. Now, Booleans are essentially just true or false. All right, let me do a little bit of window management here. Have a little too much opened up. All right, Booleans are essentially just true or false. There is evaluation operators that I can use to run comparisons. And then there's double comparisons. So let's dive into that for now. So again, a Boolean is essentially just true, or I can write it as false. Notice that it's all lowercase letters. Python is in capital letters. In this case, we're utilizing lowercase letters. Now, when it comes to comparison operators, I can say what's this? I can compare something like 0 to 0. And this will actually return false. Now, why is that returning false? They're both the number 0, but they're different data types. This 3 equal sign means that it's checking both the value and the data type. If I do something like double equals, it's not going to check the data type. It is only going to check the value. So it would return true. It would say that the value of 0 in a number is the same as the value of 0 inside of a string. Now, this is very confusing. So to avoid any confusion, we will always, moving forward, when conducting comparisons, utilize a triple equal sign. It has to be a very unique scenario that you run into, so unique that I don't think I can provide one off the top of my head, where you would actually utilize a double equal sign to do any sort of comparison. So although that is knowledge that I would like you all to have, just remember this is a loosely typed comparison, whereas triple equal sign is a strictly typed comparison. Do not ever do comparisons utilizing a loosely typed comparison. It's going to create a lot of misbehavior. All right, let's hear it, Dallas.
So is that the same as the double equals in Python as triple equals in JavaScript?
Correct.
Okay, that's all I need.
All right. Start doing a little bit of other comparisons here. I can ask, hey, is 0 greater than 1? And this would actually return to me false. I can ask if it's less than 1. And again, whoa, hello. Moving a little too fast there. This will return true. I can do less than or equals. And I can also do greater than or equals. All right, let's hear it, Michael.
Can you compare different data types with greater than equals, stuff like that?
You can, yeah. So if I can do characters as well. I can say, hey, is A greater than Z? You'll see that returns false. And if I run it by less than, we would expect that to return true.
Could you do like you did before, 0 and then a string of 0?
Let's try that out. I wouldn't be surprised if this actually works. Unfortunately, that works, but I don't recommend it. Does that answer your question, Michael? I see the head nods. Perfect. All right, Daniel.
When you're comparing those letters, is it comparing just the ASCII value of the letters?
It is, yes. It's actually interpreted into a numerical function and then doing the comparison under the hood.
So it's not doing truthy or falsy for them?
No. No, we're going to cover truthy and falsy here shortly as well. All right. So now that we know that information regarding these comparisons, let's start talking about double comparisons. Now, when it comes to double comparisons, I always like to reference this diagram. And means that both conditions have to be met in order for that statement to evaluate to true. Or means that either condition on each side must be true in order for the entire statement to evaluate to true. So let's keep this simple. Let's keep this simple and go with numbers here. I'm gonna go ahead and say, is 0 less than 1? And is 3 greater than 5? When I run this code, I expect this to return true. When it's returning false. Why is that? 3 greater, oh, there you go. Less than 5. There you go. Now it's returning true. Because 0 is in fact less than 1, and 3 is in fact less than 5. Both of these evaluate to true. So the AND comparison altogether comes back as true. I'm doing double comparisons there. If one of them was to evaluate to false, meaning 3 greater than 5, we know that that's false, then the entire statement would come back as false. Gary, go ahead.
Are you screen sharing?
I am. Are people not able to see my screen?
I see it.
Oh,
Okay.
it's just me.
Perfect. All right. So that's our AND comparison. Let's turn it into OR. When I turn it into an OR statement, only one of them has to evaluate to true. We know that 0 is less than 1, but 3 greater than 5 is false. Well, when I run this, this still comes back as true, because at least one of the two conditions evaluated to true. So that's our double comparisons. Does anyone have any questions about Boolean statements or comparisons? Perfect. Seems like we have no questions. So let's go ahead and keep pushing forward here. The next thing we're going to cover is going to be undefined. Now, undefined is quite literally a variable that doesn't hold a value. If I console.log, or excuse me, doesn't return a value, nothing, you'll see that it is undefined. Nothing exists. There is a storage somewhere for nothing. But it's not holding anything. It does not return a value. And that is why we see undefined. Now, there is a clear difference between undefined and null. When I console.log absence, I get null. So this nothing does not return a value. There's still a variable that exists that does not return a value. Here, it returns a value, but its value is that of, or is empty. Nothing actually exists within null, but the variable absence has a value assigned to it. Its value is just empty. Nothing has a value, does not have a value assigned to it, which is why it returns undefined, right? Instead of thinking about it of, I hear people talk about it of, hey, this is just the one of them exists and the other one doesn't exist. Don't think about it in that perspective. Think about it as far as what it returns, because nothing has no assignment to it. It returns nothing. So we get undefined. And absence actually has a variable assigned to it. It's just that the variable or the data that was assigned to it is that of an empty data, which is why it returns no. All right. I see hands up. Let me hear from Mike.
When would you use something like this?
So null is very good to utilize whenever you're doing something like a user or you're making an application. Something like saying, hey, and I'm just gonna write it here. If the user is null, meaning it doesn't, Jesus, it doesn't exist, then don't allow user into specific URL patterns. Otherwise, show user profile. Right? So that's something for null being existing. The typical reason why you would see undefined is undefined happens most of the time through user error, where a return value is expected but was not provided. Does that answer your question, Michael?
So like undefined, would that be like those little surveys you give us at the end if we don't fill out something and it's like you didn't put in a value when one was required, would that be like undefined?
That would be more of null. Right.
Okay. Like don't let them submit it because nothing was added into it.
Right.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Of course. Dallas?
For undefined and null, is it one of them or both of them? Can you add to them, like maybe doing plus plus after either of them? Would it work for them at all?
No. Both undefined and null are data structures that you can't really interact with unless you change their value. So they need something to be, you have to do variable reassignment. Undefined and null are not going to be anything that you can interact with in a meaningful manner. One of the most common errors that you'll see is property, etc. I'm just filling that in, does not exist in object null. That's going to be one of the most common values that you'll see. If you try to do any type of mathematical operator or try to access null in any sort of way, it's going to return this as an error. And if you try to do any operator to something like undefined, it's just going to tell you that you can't do that because the value is undefined. Does that answer your question, Dallas?
Um, yeah, I think I can expand on it a little bit more too. So if in a dictionary or called an object in JavaScript, I think you have all these different people and different items, and one of them is null, but you want to add to it a value outside of you want to push something to that or append that dictionary from outside the function. Can you do that for null or undefined?
You can definitely still do reassignment and change the value. But that's different than interacting with null itself, right? You're
Okay.
reassigning the value, getting rid of the old value of null, and giving that property a new value, which that you can do.
Okay, that's all I need.
And I saw another hand go up, but I might have missed it.
No, we're all good. That was
Okay,
me.
perfect. All right. Does anyone have any questions over undefined versus null? Okay, perfect. If no one has any questions over undefined versus null, then let's go ahead and keep pushing into our arrays. And let me actually check the time because I've been talking for a while. And actually, we are just in time for a break. Perfect. It is currently 10 o'clock or 10:01. Let's take a 9-minute break and come back and continue our lecture at 10:10. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and start talking about arrays. Now, arrays are pretty simple as far as how they work. Whenever you start an array will always have these parentheses on the outside. And then you can also think of them as kind of like a train of cards, right? Where every single index can hold values. Now, these values can be either numbers, booleans, objects. They can be almost anything and anything that you can store inside of JavaScript in each and every single one of those cards. So for example, if I wanted to do something like my days, or let my days be equal to an array where I have Monday, maybe I have Tuesday. Let's do a little bit of shorthand there to make sure that we're not wasting too much time. We have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So all of my days of the week would be living in there. I can also have an array that's somewhat mixed. Let's say let my array have different values. Maybe it's holding 1. It could be holding true. It can also be holding a string. And you'll notice that every single one of these values is separated by a comma whenever you're writing them out. Now, with that said, arrays are something that you can access through indexes, just like string. I can say that I want to log to my console, something like my days, index, and go with index 6. And when I execute that line of code, you'll see that it returns Sunday. I can also something like my array. And my array, maybe I just want index 1. And there, I will return something like true. All right, so that's typically how an array works. It can a list that you can store multiple values inside of it, and you can iterate or manipulate this array. I can easily assign values into this as well. So for example, I can say my array at index 1 is actually going to be equal to false. And if I run this same line of code again, you'll see that the first time it was executed in line 57, it returned true. In line 58, I utilize variable reassignment, meaning that now my new array demonstrates as follows. And when I go to console.log my array again, that's how I get false at the very end. All right, again, this is just the very surface of arrays. If you go to W3 schools, as I provided in here, we're going to have a ridiculous amount of static methods. Popular ones to ensure that you go over are going to be join, pop, push, shift, and unshift. I strongly recommend that you guys go through those. Array.length is also a pretty good and common one, and that one just returns the length of the array in a numerical value. All right, so dot length. You'll see that it just returns 3 because there's only 3 items inside of it. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding arrays? Perfect. Looks like arrays were pretty straightforward. So now let's start talking about objects. Now, can I get somebody to read these 2 notes here?
Key value pair storage for for same or alternating data types that grants instant access to stored data types. Objects are typically utilized to represent nouns in order to further expand upon the characteristics of said noun, i.e. a car.
All right, awesome. Thank you. So let's start talking about these objects. And I'm going to go ahead and take that car example. So I could just say, hey, let a car is equal to this car. Maybe it's a 2012 Ford Focus. And it has 217,000 miles to it. All right. Now this is and I can even go into specifying, hey, this Ford Focus is also gray. Let's just leave it at that, right? Well, this is one way to write my car, but it doesn't really give me much accessibility to this information. And if I needed to change any information regarding this car, I wouldn't really be able to, or even grab information regarding this car. I would have to do some sort of function, and I would have to make sure that my data is always following this exact pattern so that there's no discrepancy within my data. Well, that's not a good way of storing information, right? And it's not going to be something to easily maintain or just to set up for writing new cars that are being inputted. So what else can I do? Well, this is where objects come in. Now, an object is defined by curly brackets. And here I can say something like, hey, I want there to be a year. And the year of this car is 2012. The color of this car would be gray. The make of this car would be Ford. And let me make sure that there's consistency there. Then there's the model of this car, which would be a Focus. And then finally, I have mileage of this car, which in this case is 217,000 miles. Ooh, there you go. And that would end my object there. You can see how there's a clear difference here, right? My sentence, although yes, it stores my information, it doesn't really give me a good format to be able to access this information. Whereas now, I have a clear way to be able to access this info. Now let's talk about that accessing portion. Arrays was something that I had to essentially iterate through in order to grab any sort of value inside of it. All right. Here, I would have to essentially say, hey, index 3 or index 2. But even though I said index 2, under the hood, JavaScript still starts at index 0. And it says, oh, this isn't the one I want. Then it comes over and it checks index 1. It says, oh, this is the one I want. And then finally it grabs index 2 and returns the item inside of it. But even though I am calling it by an index, it's not instantly grabbing it out of the array. It may look like it, but that's not what's happening. Under the hood, it is always iterating from left to right, and then stopping once the conditions are met to return a value. Now, when it comes to an object is more of like a locker where it has specific key value pairs. So if I were to take a look at a couple of examples here, something like the year, when I inputted it, we said that it was 2012. Let me just make this locker a little bit bigger there. We also said that the mileage was something like 217,000 miles. And for lack of space, I'm just going to leave it at 217. We could say that the make was Focus, or it's maybe model. Yeah, it was model. Model is Focus. And then we could even have that the color was gray. Notice that the way I'm writing it, it's randomized, right? And that's the way objects work, unfortunately. When it stores the data is being stored randomly. There's not necessarily an order to how data is being stored inside of this object. But what is neat about it is that if I have the key to year, the moment I pass in year, there's no iteration. I immediately come over and grab my year straight out from the object. If I wanted to grab the color, it would immediately come over and grab my color. There's no portion where it's looking from left to right or from right to left. It's immediately accessing the data, pulling it out, and making it accessible to me. So let's take a look at that. How do I grab information out of this object? Well, I can just go ahead and say, hey, I want to grab from my car object something like the color. And in doing so, you'll see that it returns gray. There's a couple of other ways to be able to access object properties. Because it is a property, I can also access it through dot notation. So I can say, hey, I want to access the color of an object. Now, this is unique to JavaScript and JavaScript only. Actually, scratch that. This is unique to JavaScript, and between JavaScript and Python, Python will not allow you to utilize dot notation to access properties inside of dictionaries. Objects in JavaScript, you can access their properties through dot notation. Does anyone have any questions regarding objects?
Yes, if they're unordered, how would you typically, I guess, iterate through them in a loop? Iterate through the key value pairs.
We're going to be going over that here shortly once we go into our looping portion.
And would there be an order? Okay, and is there going to be an order, consistent order to how it loops over them?
There will be, but not
Okay.
because it's going to be inside of a dictionary. What we'll do is we'll churn the object into an array of arrays. That way we can maintain a consistent order to iterate.
Okay, and so we are able to control the order when we turn it into that array then. Okay, thank you.
Of course. Timer?
So is an object like a hash map?
Yes, essentially. That's the way kind of it interprets under the hood.
Okay, got you. Thanks.
Dallas?
Is there significance for it being the difference between arrays and objects? For what you mentioned about directly accessing or going through looping the whole way, does that matter just on the outside portion, actually run the program for like RAM purposes, or why does that matter at all?
So it comes in both into the main place where it's going to really have an impact is going to be in time complexity. So if you're solving some sort of algorithm and you need to structure your data, time complexity is going to be where that really bites into it. If you're utilizing an array instead of utilizing an object where you could have used an object, it's going to reflect heavily once you start looking at the performance of your algorithm.
Okay, thank you.
Andy?
Francisco, does the key have to be in a quotation? Kind of gets me confusing with that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. And it does not, actually. If we are creating a key, the key being in quotation marks, it's optional. I can still access year. And you'll see that this still works just perfectly fine. Why, you may ask? Because JavaScript. It gives you the option to either utilize quotations or no quotations whenever you are writing a key. These are essentially under the hood going to turn into properties. Properties are just variables that belong to an object. That's why you don't need the quotation marks. Does that answer your question, Andy? Perfect. Nick?
Can you put a space in a key? Like year space in, just for example?
Year space in?
And I think that breaks it, right?
Yes, that would break it. If you want to do something like that, just stick to camel
But
key.
if you put it back in quotes, I think the quotes are only aren't the quotes only necessary if you have a space inside the key?
You could do that as well.
Something like that, yeah.
So if you do it this way, you would also have to call it as such, and you would have to limit it this way. Typically, don't put spaces inside of your keys. Just utilize camel casing. You want to make sure that this is accessible to all JavaScript developers. And if you do something like this, it's not necessarily a killer, but somebody who is experienced in programming will probably make a face to something like that. Does that answer your question, Nick? All right, perfect. Any other questions? Fantastic. Then if there aren't any other questions, let's start looking at some of these W3 schools methods. So there is a couple of methods that we can utilize in in JavaScript objects. Now, I want to make it clear, these are called static methods. A method for an object is different inside of JavaScript. So please just know that these are notated as static methods. Now, the static method here of assign will actually grab an object and assign it to its key and value pair to a separate object. Object create will create an object. Object.entries, this is going to return an array of key value pair arrays, which I believe kind of addresses your question from earlier, Justin, as to how we would keep some sort of order. You would have to turn it into an array to make sure that stays.
Is there a default order that it goes to, or do you have to specify the order as you're doing so?
By default, it will reflect the same input that you have in here.
Okay, that makes sense.
Awesome. We have keys, which returns which returns an array of all of the keys. And then we have values, which returns an array of all of the values. All right. Pretty much all of these, or here, these four, excuse me, are going to be very commonly used. If you want to get fancy, and as far as when it comes to objects, I would recommend looking at group by and how that works. That's going to be further on when we'll start utilizing something like this, but this group by will become important later on. All right. Questions about objects before we move on into functions? Fantastic. If there are no questions about objects, let's start talking about some functions now. So functions, pretty easy. We can go ahead and make a function. Again, a function, excuse me, let me restart this. When it comes to functions, functions will always have a purpose. I'm sure we have seen something like this before. The only difference when it comes to mathematical functions or functions just inside of programming methods is that the inputs may or may not be provided. And outputs or return statements also may or may not be provided. We may have a function that takes no inputs. For example, if I create a function that says hello, it doesn't necessarily need any input, right? It just console.logs hello. Now this function here takes in no inputs, and it also provides no output. It does, however, have an action. Right? Typically, we'll have a repeated set of steps or sort of action that we need to happen over and over again. And that's the entire reason why we create functions. So if I were to call this function, I would just say hello. And this open and closing parentheses is what calls the function. So now when I run node at main.js, we get hello onto the console. Now here's the tricky part. What if I were to console.log say hello? What would that return?
It's going to print it and return undefined.
Perfect. It's going to print, or it's going to log to the console hello, and then it's going to log to the console undefined. Well, where's this undefined coming from? Can anybody take a guess at that?
Because you didn't return a value.
Yeah, I never returned a value. So the function say hello returns nothing. And if we took a look at our null versus undefined earlier, we talked about how undefined happens when there is no return value that was provided, but one was expected. So let's fix this function. Let's add a couple of things here. Or let's create a separate function that will actually return values and take in inputs. So we have a function called make full name. And this function takes in a first name and last name. This function would then return first name plus maybe a space plus last name. Now this function that we've created here of make full name takes in inputs. The inputs are first name and last name. It conducts an action. The action being adding first and last name together to create one string of a full name. And it does return a value. Which that full value is the sum of first and last name. If we want to make this a little bit more explicit, we could say full name and return full name. All right, so in this example, we are taking in inputs. It's first and last name. The action that's happening inside of the function machine is adding those names together, and the output would be the full name. So now, if I call make full name here in my script, what would that do?
It's going to execute the code, but not print anything to the screen.
Awesome. Yeah, I would never see anything on my machine. Why? Because it did execute the code, right? It called, which honestly we expected to see some sort of error here since we didn't provide inputs, but JavaScript. So let me go ahead and do Francisco and then pass in Avila there. So now we have the inputs. Even then, when I go to execute the code, nothing appears. I'm providing an input and I'm providing an output, but I am not logging said output to my console. So I can say console.log, make full name, and now I get Francisco Avila as my return statement. All right. Any questions regarding functions? Go ahead, Dallas.
Okay, so you're in the previous example, you console logged, you printed out to the terminal, but that's not the output. That's just an action. Whereas in the example you just made here with the full name, make full name, the returning is the output, even if there's nothing printed out and no one ever sees anything happen. That's what output is.
Correct.
Is there any other example of output besides return? Is that just what you mean all the time?
I believe that I'm going to say that for now, until we encounter a different situation, look at return as always being the output for your function.
Gladly, it keeps it simple.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Now, because we have a return statement there, we can assign the return value to a variable. I can say let my full name and make that equal to make full name and pass in Francisco Avila. And in doing so, when I go into console.logging this statement, I can just console.log my full name. So what is happening here? I'm calling the function. Francisco and Avila get passed into the function. The function executes the action, but then it provides an output, being the full name. Well, that output gets stored inside of the variable my full name. So when I go to log it into the console, I get Francisco Avila in the console again. Oh, hello. Let me clear my drawings here. Perfect. And there it is. Francisco Avila is still showing up inside of our terminal. All right. If there aren't any other questions regarding functions, we're going to move into our ternary operators. So let me give it one last shot here. Does anyone have any questions regarding functions? Send a timer.
It's not about functions. I actually wanted to ask a question about objects again.
Yeah.
So you said that objects, they behave under the hood like hash maps. Do they also behave as like object classes for like OOP and JavaScript?
They do. You need to actually access a keyword if you want to do OOP. JavaScript is not an object-oriented programming language. It's getting to that spot, and or their way of mimicking that behavior is by providing the new keyword. But everything inside of an object under the hood is essentially a class.
Okay, got you. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Perfect. Doesn't look like there are any other questions, so let's go ahead and close the chapter on functions. So now that we're done with functions, let's go into some ternary operators. For ternary operators, we have if, else, and else if. So we're going to bring back a little bit of Boolean here, or we can talk about Booleans. But essentially, it's saying, hey, if a condition is met, so if 3 is greater than 2, excuse me, then I want to console.log first condition met. And I can just say else. And by saying else, I can say console.log default statement triggered. If I go to execute this information, we'll see that my first condition is met. If I change it, then I get my default statement was triggered. I can also add a third condition or many other conditions. I can say else if and open up a body. So in this else if, I can say, hey, else if 5 is greater than 2. Then console.log second statement or second condition was triggered. When I go into do this, I get my second condition being triggered. Else ifs can happen over and over again, and you can have as many else ifs as you would like. If you're going to, or you're writing something and you realize that you have more than 3 or 4 else if statements, start looking into utilizing something like a switch statement instead. It will help you as far as syntax. It will make your code look cleaner, and they'll avoid something called a code smell. I'll just leave that terminology out there, a code smell, just for everybody to go ahead and make sure you look into that later on outside of class hours. It's a concept to just have in the back of your head as you're writing code. Andy?
I've come to a few errors when I didn't use else when doing an if. is there a reason for that? Because you don't necessarily need an else for the code to work, right? It would just go if the if doesn't work, it would just continue down the line of code. So I was wondering what's the reason sometimes the errors pop up.
Interesting. Do you by any chance remember what error you might have been running into?
No, not off the top of my head. It's been a while.
Okay. You're completely right. We don't necessarily need an else statement, right? We could always just say, hey, if this all doesn't work here, and I'm just going to comment it out instead of deleting it because I don't want that code to go away. And I go to execute this, well, then our default statement would be triggered, right? This condition was never met, so it just goes into our default statement. As far as why you could have gotten some sort of error for that, I'm not necessarily sure. I would have to look at the circumstances. But when you're first writing out your code or we're first starting out, I strongly recommend just go through the process of always writing an else statement just to make sure that you're applying some good control over your ternary statements and that you have a way to exit. Once you get comfortable with ternary statements, everything's going pretty much according to plan, for lack of better words, then we can start shorthanding and start avoiding writing else statements altogether. I apologize, Andy. I would have to take a look at your code to be able to give a better answer. All right. Awesome. So there's our if and else statements. Ternary operators, if else statements. All right, perfect. Does anyone have any questions about if, else if, or else? Easy peasy. Then we'll go ahead and end our ternary operators here. Now the question is, can I spell ternary? There you go. Now that we've covered ternary operators, let's go into some iterations here. So since we're going through iterations, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of arrays. So here I'm going to do my numbers, which is just going to be a list, or excuse me, an array of numbers. There you go. So there's my array of numbers. Let's go ahead and write our object. I'm just going to copy down that car object that we made earlier to keep our life simple. And this should be a good, you know what? Actually, instead of making this an array of numbers, let's do some fruit here. Let's see, pizza. What else do we have here? Let's do hot dogs. Let's do some steak. What else?
Pasta.
Eggs. Pasta. That's always a good one. Yogurt. There you go. All right, so there we go. We have our foods and we have our object. Now let's start talking about how to iterate through each one of these. First, we'll concentrate on our array. Let's say we want to iterate through an array by index. Oh, excuse me, everyone. All right, let's say I want to iterate through an array by index. I could do so by establishing a for loop. So I'm going to say for, and then I have to specify how I want to do this. Now, the most common thing you'll see is let I be equal to 0. Now, I is supposed to represent the index. I personally do not like just utilizing I because I don't feel like it really gives me much information. So what I like to do is I like to do IDX because that tells me that this is a clear representation of an index. Now here I'm establishing the index value being 0. Then I have to establish the condition that has to be met in order for this for loop to stop. So if index is less than foods dot length, so as long as index continues to be less than foods dot length, this iteration is going to continue. And after each iteration, I'm going to add to my index. So first, let's console.log the index itself. And then let's console.log the value of foods at a specific index. So now let's take a look at our terminal here. As it's iterating, the very first value is 0. 0 is, in fact, less than the length of my array. So then it conducts the body. We see 0 appearing inside of my console. And then we see foods at index 0 is pizza. At this point, the body has concluded. So we increment index by 1. 1 is less than the length of my array. So we see 1 being logged onto the console, like in line 125. In line 126, we see foods at index where we get hot dogs. And then it gets done with the body again. And it increments the index one more time. And it continues to do so until it works all the way down the list. Excuse me, down the array. Does anyone have any questions regarding a for I loop? Go ahead, Michael.
The IDX is less than foods length. Is that basically a while loop? And will it always be like that?
You could definitely write this as a while loop. The problem with writing it as a while loop is that you have to make sure this gives you more guardrails than a while loop does. When you write a while loop, there's a lot more of a possibility that you'll end up in an endless loop. When it comes to always being like this is definitely the preferred way of writing your looping methods when you're iterating through indexes. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Well, I just mean like specifically like you have in the middle of the let IDX equals 0, IDX is less than foods length, and that makes sure that it only runs while the index is still less than the length of foods. If you didn't put something there, or like what would happen? Are there other things you could do?
Like setting something to, hey, while this is true, and then eventually sending something to being false. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so because to me that sounds like a while loop. Like while the condition is true, or while IDX is less than foods.length, continue iterating through this and tell me what ingredient or food that is.
Yeah, you're definitely not wrong. The implementation of it is definitely very similar. And the way that you just mentioned it, or the way you just explained it, I would have to agree with how you utilize it, right? It is essentially just a while loop. I'm still providing the index, and then I'm manually providing, hey, this is how you do the addition. If I were to reconstruct this in a while loop, it would just look something like, hey, what? Let IDX be equal to 0 while IDX is less than foods.length. Then conduct the following, right? I would console.log the following information. And at the end of my while loop, I would also do IDX plus plus, right? So this is exactly the same thing that we have up here. The only difference is the guardrails that it provides. When it comes to a while loop, if I were to mess anything up, if, for example, if I didn't provide a condition to do something at the end of the loop, it would still work. And it would eventually just put me in an endless loop. This would throw an error if I didn't actually have a way to handle an after action. Right, so this is just utilizing this to make sure that we have guardrails implemented.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Andy?
So then essentially that just makes the while loop unnecessary, or more risky to use while loop than using the for loop, right? I mean, then what's the purpose of the while loop after that?
That's definitely a true statement there. We do not want to utilize while loops. As much as possible, try to avoid while loops at all cost. Awesome.
Just specifically in JavaScript, right? Because it's more useful in Python.
It is useful in Python, but I would say overall, just don't utilize while loops at all. Just because of the possible risk that you can end up in an endless loop. If you can write something in a while loop, you can write it in a for loop. Awesome. All right. So let's continue going forward with our iteration processes here. So we just went to iterating through an index. Now, what if I wanted to iterate through something or my array by value? Well, what I can do is for food of foods. Excuse me. It's going to be let food of foods. And then I can console.log my food. Now, when I run this information here, we can see that I went through and iterated and grabbed each independent value. Now, this portion here is just the variable that I can utilize to reference to. So I can name this X, I can name this Y, or just straight gibberish. And it would still end up working, returning each independent value inside of that array. Now let's talk about the difference between a for of and for in loop. When I run a for in loop, you'll notice a for of loop returns each independent value. A for in loop will return each independent index. This is not a useful way to iterate through an array by index, because it leaves you a little bit limited as far as how to access each independent index or manipulate the value of the index that you're currently in. But it is a tool to have in your belt. So for of loop iterates by value, for in loop iterates by index. Does anyone have any questions about the for of or for in loops? Carlos?
All right, so in that first for loop, is there still a way of doing the console log for the index as well? How would you do it? Since you don't have the IDX variable.
So you're saying in this for in loop, how would I grab the value?
No. So in the first one, let food of foods. How would you? So you got the value on there, but if you want to console log the index of that particular food as well.
Let's see, console.log, and then this would be foods dot index of.
Okay.
There you go. And I believe that will work it. Yep.
Okay. All right. Easy enough then.
Perfect. All right. Fantastic. Now let's go into the real animal, right? How do we iterate through an object? Well, as we mentioned earlier, an object is essentially something that's randomized as far as data goes. So if it's randomized as far as data, how could I possibly iterate through it effectively? Well, the answer is simple. I just can't. I need to convert it. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to utilize a function called object.entries. Let's console log that. Let's say let converted object be equal to object.entries and pass in our cart object. And let's just take a look at what that ends up being converted to in the terminal. Now, when we iterate through it, we can see that we have year, 2012, color, gray. The object has just been turned into an array of arrays, where the key value pairs are refined as index 0 and index 1 inside of my array. Great. Well, that gives me the ability to do a for of loop, right? If I go ahead and do for key, let key value pair of converted object, and I just log on to the console, my key value pair, we'll go ahead and iterate, and for every iteration, we get each one of those key and value pairs. Well, let's take it a step further. This is somewhat great because I'm able to see an array that I can interact with both of them. And if I wanted to divide them, I could do something like let key be equal to key value pair be at index 0. And I can do something like let value be equal to key value pair at index 1. And then I can do key, comma, val. And all of this works. All right, I can even separate them. I can say, hey, this is going to be the key. This is going to be the value. When I iterate through it, we can see that everything works the way I want it to. I now have my key and value pair separated, and I was able to iterate through it. And everything stays nice and organized, which solves our problem of having unorganized data inside of an object. Well, now let's take it even further. Currently, I've made quite a bit of steps to be able to iterate through this information. Now, it's important to remember that this converted object is an array of arrays, where the children arrays are of length there it is, of 2. Why is that important? Let's take a look here. If I were to rewrite this function and make it shorthanded, I can say for let key, comma, val of converted object. And doing this alone would give me the access to do the following.
Do you have to run a method on converted object in that line?
I don't believe I do. I think the
Something need to be inside the square brackets.
yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. I think they just need to be nested inside of square brackets. Perfect. Thank you. So what am I doing here? All right. What exactly is happening under the hood? Well, we know that converted array is an array that holds multiple arrays of 1 and 2, or excuse me, 0 and 1. And 0 and 1. Well, what we're doing here for key value pair is we're just saying, hey, I know there's going to be a 0 and a 1. I want key to be represented by 0. And I want val to be represented by 1. And that is how we get this key value pair of the construction so that we have somewhat of an instant access to it. If I wanted to write it all in one line, I could even take away this converted object portion and just write it straight in there. So object.entries of car object, we know that is going to return an array of arrays with key value pairs inside of it that we can destroy and reference to as their independent variables of key and val. And that's how you iterate through an object. Does anyone have any questions over how to iterate through an object? Does anyone have any questions over iteration overall?
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
My bad, man. So is that the object.entries and then you pass your object? Is that the same thing as fruits.entries or sorry, foods.entries with no nothing passed to it?
Foods wouldn't. What do you mean foods dot
Or
entry?
sorry, we're in the I guess in the converted object. That's the one that's the array, right? Or if you pass it the object itself. So what's the original object name? Is it just car object? Yeah. So if you do car object dot entries and don't pass it anything, is that the same thing or is that something different? Because I think I've seen the other way. Maybe I'm thinking about something else.
Interesting. Let's try it out. Let's see. Let's do car object dot entries. I don't believe this will work, but let's try it. Yeah, this doesn't work in this case.
No, so in the sorry, in that second for loop you have on the screen, the shortened version. So instead of doing object dot entries car object, replace the object dot entries with car object dot entries. Yeah.
This portion here. Replace it with car object.
Yeah, car object dot entries and then parentheses, yeah.
Yes, it's gonna return an error.
Okay,
So
okay.
Yeah, dot entries belongs to the object class. So that's why we have to call object. And entries is a method that belongs to that class. And that's
Gotcha. Okay.
our object. All right. Alex?
So in that bottom for loop, when you're initializing key and val with let, is it so that one let statement is initializing both key and val?
Correct. This one
Okay.
statement is initializing both variables of key and val.
Okay. And also key and val are initialized in the for loop above that. Can you initialize the same variables twice with let statements, like in the same code?
So that's going to be a scoping thing. So key and val only exist inside of this for loop.
Okay.
The moment this for loop closes, everything inside of that for loop no longer exists, which is the reason why I can still create key and val later on. Right?
Okay.
Only exists pertaining to their parent for loop.
So if you initialized key and val outside of the for loop and then just like had it be null and then define it within the for loop, then it would exist outside of the for loop as null, or would it be redefined in the for loop and then the scope would stay global?
The scope would stay global and be redefined within the for loop.
Okay. And it would keep the values that were defined in the for loop when it left the for loop, or would it revert back to null?
It would never refer back to null. No. So
Okay.
it would always keep the last value that was set to it as a variable reassignment.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thanks.
Of course. Michael?
Sorry if I missed it, but why do you not have converted object in the second for loop? Is there a reason?
Just shorthand. Instead of having to assign it to a new variable like I did here, I'm just skipping that step so I can just write less lines of code and just doing it within the same line.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? All right, perfect. In that case, let's go ahead and move on into our intermediate JavaScript, part 2. Oh, that's my marker. Let me turn that off. Perfect. Where's my iterations? There they are. So for intermediate JavaScript, the first thing we're going to discuss is truthy versus falsy. And somebody else had already mentioned it previously of something called truthy versus falsy. Well, we know that there's Boolean types such as true and false, but it turns out that other data types such as numbers, strings, objects are also or can also be evaluated to be true or false. So let's go ahead and write an if statement here. This if statement will go ahead and log on to the console. And this is truthy. And let's have an else statement that will log on to the console that this is falsy. All right, so starting off with true. Well, we know that that is going to come out to be truthy. All right, well, what if we default to false? That is going to come out to be falsy. That one looks pretty self-explanatory. Let's start diving into strings. Starting off with an empty string. Well, an empty string gives me falsy. What about a string that holds a value inside of it? Well, that gives me truthy. So a string without value is falsy, and a string without any value is truthy. Well, I wonder what's going on there. Can anybody take a guess at why each one of them is evaluating to truthy or falsy?
It's comparing if it has a value or not.
Nice. Yeah, it's comparing if it's occupying memory allocation, right? If its string has memory allotted to it, then it's going to evaluate to be truthy. And if it doesn't, it's going to evaluate to be falsy. So with that statement in mind, what do we think 0 is going to return?
Truthy.
All right, we say truthy. What else?
I say false.
All right, so we got some votes for falsy and some votes for truthy. Let's see it. Let's come back falsy because 0 does not occupy space, right? If I were to utilize a number such as 1, then we can expect to see truthy. All right, so now let's get into the more complex stuff. All right, these are our primitive data types that we just compared. Well, what if I were using a complex data type, like an array, an empty array? What would that do?
Doesn't take up space. It's falsy.
Gives you a falsy.
All right, now let's go ahead and execute it. Well, it turns out that an empty array, whether it has values inside of it or not, will always occupy space because JavaScript, all right? So even if I were to write a value inside of it, nothing would change. Complex data structures will always evaluate to truthy.
If you put 0 in there, would it be truthy still?
Yeah, let's go ahead and pass that in.
Cancel it out. No, okay.
Yeah. All right. So now what happens if I pass in an empty object? Well, we would expect this to come back to be truthy because it is a complex data structure. So it still occupies space under the hood and evaluates it as true. So there's our truthy versus falsy. Does anyone have any questions regarding truthy versus falsy? Andy.
So like now that you've blown my mind about this, how is this applicable?
Yeah, how is this applicable? So once we start working inside of more advanced scripts, such as we're inside of our React application, it is going to be common, or I see a common trend where you'll expect an object to eventually populate into a variable. So a lot of students, what they do is they initialize this variable as an empty object, and then they'll try to write an if statement saying, hey, if this object, then show this, and if the object doesn't exist, or if it evaluates to being false, then don't show anything, right? But an object will always evaluate to be true, whether it's empty or not. So that's kind of where that starts coming in. It interacts with your shorthand, and it will make your life easier to truly understand true the and falsy within JavaScript. Unfortunately, within Python, it's going to be quite the opposite. So we're going to have to make sure that we understand true the and falsy statements both inside of JavaScript and Python. Does that answer your question? Perfect. All right. So now that we understand true the and falsy, let's go ahead and start diving into arrow functions. Oh, hello. Now, arrow functions are pretty much the new standard for writing functions. I believe in ES6 and above, it has become extremely common to only write functions in arrow notation, and you're no longer utilizing the keyword function. From this moment moving forward, you can still utilize the keyword function, but know that once we enter the React environment, that's pretty much going to exit the scope of things, and we're just going to strictly utilize arrow function moving forward. All right, so arrow functions. Let's dive into them. And let's actually grab one of the functions that we built before and rewrite it as an arrow function. As soon as I find it, where did you go? Here you are. Here you are. All right, so here's a function that we had created before. Now, let's say we wanted to recreate this function as an arrow function. Well, the way to do this is I would start by writing const, saying, hey, this is going to be a constant variable of make full name. Now, this variable will take in parameters of first name and last name. Nothing too crazy just yet. And it will provide the following body. And we can just straight copy and paste this body here of let full name be equal to, let's get fancy and use some interpolated string here, first name and last name. And let's finally return my full name. So there you go. That's it. We're just writing the arrow function. The only thing that changed was the very first line. Instead of utilizing the function keyword, I am writing it as an arrow function. Now, why, you may ask? It doesn't seem like there's any difference. So why am I doing this to begin with? Okay, well, that's definitely a great question. As of now, let's go ahead and console.log this output. And like always, let's pass in Fran, and let's just pass in Av for shorthand. All right, and we get Fran Av showing up inside of our, inside of our terminal. But what's the point of this? Nothing changed. Well, what actually changes is my ability to shorthand my code even further. Instead of writing my entire arrow function, this function only has one action, and that one action can become my output. So I could just have it say, hey, I just want to return the following statement. And when I run this still works. Well, here's where the real beauty of arrow functions come in. Since my function is so simple and it's only conducting one action, I actually don't need to have or to have curly brackets at all. I could just simply say, hey, this is going to be the return value. This function is going to take in 2 parameters, and its return value will be as follows. And when I execute this code, you'll see that it still works. So that's the beauty of our arrow functions. It's the ability to shorthand our code even further. All right, you can see how we grabbed our original function, turned it into the following, and then now we have a default, meaning that it's not conducting many actions, for being able to return a statement or being able to provide a return value. Go ahead, Nick.
Would this be an example of refactoring code?
What I just did, yes.
Okay. Is that a common thing in industry? People are going to take the old version, old code, and do stuff like this to it, not change the underlying function, but make it.
Yes. I think you finished speaking. I'm not sure if your headphones died.
My headset messed up. I don't know what's going on. Is this a common thing people do in industry? Take old code and bring it up to modern, I guess, syntax?
It is very common. It's called technical debt. If you go into a company that has a lot of technical debt, that means that they essentially have a lot of stuff that has been written a very long time ago and needs to be refactored and brought up to speed with today's norms. All right. Keegan?
So that arrow function, is it working kind of like a lambda does, or is it just saying, hey, I want you to return this code to the right of me?
It is very similar to a lambda function. I think it would be the direct I guess mirror reflection between JavaScript and Python would be a lambda function. Just know that under the hood, they are behaving differently, but as far as syntax and functionality, they're providing the same output, right? But if you were to take a look at them like under the hood and how they're working and everything that they're doing as far as real-time updates and how it's relating to the script, they would function a little bit differently from one another. Does that
All
answer?
right. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. Any other questions? Go ahead, Dallas.
You mentioned it being refactoring, like improving it. Is this, are arrow functions more preferred than how we were doing it before with function make full name?
They are preferred because of the shorthand, and then also because of their efficiency. Under the hood, they perform at a higher level than functions that are established to the keyword function.
Okay, is it basically a straight up upgrade, like going from var to let or const? Where you just don't want to use var anymore? Would you ever want to use function anymore?
It's some sort of a deprecation. Yes. At this point, we just don't want to utilize the keyword function.
Okay.
Awesome. Any other questions? Perfect. In that case, that's going to conclude our arrow function portion. Now let's start talking about a little bit of an iteration tools, such as map and filtered. Let me grab that foods array that we had earlier. All right. So currently what we're used to utilizing whenever we're iterating through an array is a for loop. But a map function will actually allow us to iterate through an array pretty much exactly the same way as a for of loop. So for example, I can call the array of foods and utilize the map method. Now, the map method takes in a variable. You can say, hey, I want this to be referenced to as food. And just like an arrow function, I could just simply provide one action and it will iterate through it and provide that said one action. If I wanted to add multiple things, I can open up a body And I can say, hey, well, instead I want to my food be equal to Francisco 8, and then putting food in there. And then console.log my food. And then maybe after I do this, I'm also creating some sort of other so let's go ahead and say let Francisco's foods be equal to an empty array. And I can do something like Francisco's foods dot push my food. Right, when I execute this, first it iterates, it creates my food. It goes ahead and logs that onto the console. And then at the very end, you'll notice that while I was going through this map statement, I was also building another array. All right. And then we'll talk about something else that's going on here. Let's hear from Andy.
In this case, the food, the variable of the function, it can be replaced with anything, right? Is acting like an index, or how is this acting right now?
Yeah. So this is iterating by value, not by index, but by value. And this could definitely be referenced to as anything. We could just name it X if we wanted to. Oh. We could name it X and send that through, and that would still work exactly the same. Now, if I wanted to actually keep track of the index, I could pass in a second variable named IDX. And by default, the map method knows that IDX is supposed to represent the index. So I could console.log. Or actually, let's just put in here IDX. And by running it, we can see we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
It knows the keyword or the specifically IDX, or is it just the second item that's passed to it? Like, could you rename IDX to anything else?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah, so I could go ahead and just, and that would still just return it. All right. Awesome. Any other questions before I move forward? Because it's about to get even better. All right, let's hear it, Andy.
So essentially the map method, is that like a shorthand for a for loop? Is that what it is?
Up to this point, yes, but there's something else that makes the map method unique that I haven't gone into just yet. All right, so let me finish it out now. It's time to close the loop, right? Because as of now, if it's just a shorthand, it doesn't really bring me much value, right? What's the whole point? It just looks like more confusing syntax. I get it that it's shorthand, but it just looks like confusing syntax to me. Well, what this actually does, the map method returns a new array. So currently I'm building Francisco's foods by pushing it into a new array, all right? But what I can actually do is I can say let Francisco's foods be equal to foods.map. And I'm no longer pushing. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly return my food. Right? It is returning my food every iteration and building a new array for every index. So now let's execute this. You'll see that Francisco's foods is still exactly the same. As it iterates through it, it creates the my food statement, and then it returns for that index my food. So a new array is being built where this action is happening for every index and building a new array. And that's what makes the map method so unique. It's the fact that it returns a new list. All right, any questions regarding the map method? There was a hand up and it disappeared. Oh no, Daniel, go ahead.
So is this kind of like the enumerate function with Python?
Similar, yes, where it actually returns a new list. That's correct. All right. I know this one's a big step, and we've been going for quite a bit, so I wouldn't doubt it if we got burnt out. If after we go to lunch, we come back and we still have questions regarding the map method, we'll go ahead and readdress it then. And actually, I think this is going to be a natural stopping point. I can see it in everyone's faces. We're all about done with today's lecture. So let's go ahead and take a huge break, and then we'll come back this afternoon to finish off our lecture. So let me go ahead and pause for now. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and continue with part 2 of our intermediate JavaScript phase. We just finished talking about the map function. Hopefully, we had a good enough time to go ahead and digest this and maybe develop some questions. So before I continue, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions regarding the map function. Go ahead, Dallas.
Don't know how to put this any better. I don't get it. So I'm happy to spend a lot more time on it. I don't know how effective that is for class time, but me and a couple others were just dealing with map stuff, and I think what we landed on is we could break an object into an array of arrays, but that's as much as I could muster.
Okay, perfect. We'll go ahead and iterate through it a little bit further. Let me go ahead and listen to Andy's question here, and then we'll go ahead and continue with
Yeah, I had the same question, so it's okay. I was in that group.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and go through this. Let's see. What can we do here? I'm going to go ahead and build a for of loop, and then we'll go ahead and compare the for of loop to our map method. All right, so here I have my for of loop where I have food of, and I'm going to go ahead and add that let there, of foods. And I'm just going to simply console.log food for now. And let me go ahead and return something like this is food. All right, so it's just a simple loop iteration, right? For of console.log food. Interesting. Why is it only doing one? Log food. Oh, because it has a return statement.
Return.
There you go. Here we go. All right, so we iterate through it and we get this whole this is food being made, all right? Now, we're iterating through the array. We could do the same thing with the map function. So I can call the array, say map, pass in food. And then within an arrow function, I can go ahead and console.log. This is food. It's exactly the same block of code. All right, we can see it being repeated here. This is where it starts with this is pizza. Up to this point, this is strictly similar. Now, there is one, or the biggest thing that differentiates these two is that I can actually console.log this entire map iteration. And if I do that, you'll see that once that gets logged into the console, all I get is an array of undefined. I'll run it again. I get nothing but an array of undefined. Now, that is because the map method is building an array depending on the actions within the original array. So for example, this is food, right? That's up here. We have this statement saying this is food, but I'm console.logging. I'm just calling a function. I'm not returning anything. Well, if I remove that original console.log that's in there, this is now an explicit return value. So just to make sure that that's clear, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up this arrow function so that it looks more like this. All right, so I'm logging the return value of foods.map. And foods.map is going to iterate through every food and return a value inside of it. So now when I run it, I get this is food pizza, this is food hot dogs, and this is food steak. If I wanted to make a similar behavior up here, I would actually have to create a brand new array called maybe new array, make that equal to an empty array. And I would have to say new array dot push. Finally, at the end of it, I would console.log that new array. All right, so here I'm writing about 5 lines of code there before I could actually get some good return value. Where down below, I don't even need these arrow brackets, right? Because arrow functions have the ability to have an assume return statement. So I could do it all within 3 lines. And when I run it, you'll see that I get the same exact 2 arrays. One of them, I had to build a brand new one manually, push the information into it. Whereas down here, I never actually declared a new variable. I just simply returned the value of a new array by mapping through the array. I hope to help clarify a little bit. I saw a hand go up.
At least a little. Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Carlos?
So could you so when you're doing the console log there, so if you replace that console log with, assigning the output, whatever, foods.map, if you assign that to a variable, would that work?
Yeah, it would work.
Okay.
Because the dot map returns a value, so I could assign that return value to a variable. I can say let mapped array be equal to foods.map, and then I could just console log map array. And that also.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Okay. Perfect. If there aren't any other questions, then let's go ahead and continue moving on into our filter function. Oh, we'll go over turnaround statements here as well. It looks like I don't have it here in the notes, but I will make sure to cover it. All right, so the filter function, it's another, or excuse me, the filter method, it's another method that belongs to arrays. And it's a method that also returns an array. If I go through foods.filter, I can specify that for every food, I only want to return that food value if it meets a specific condition. So let's say that I only want foods that are longer than 6 characters long. Then I could say if food.length is greater than or equal to 6, then I want to return the food. Otherwise, I want to return, let's just say nothing. Right? Let's say we only leave it like this. And let's log that onto our console here. Let's say let filtered foods equal to, and look at what that returns. Well, that only returns hot dogs and yogurts. Right? What I did is I iterated through the array. So if I were to do this the old school way, I could say let foods longer than 6 I can make a for of loop. So for let foods and say if food dot length is greater than or equal to 6, then I want foods longer than 6 dot push to actually intake the food. And then finally, that would build my array so I could log it onto my console. So console.log, my food's longer than 6. When I execute this, you can see that both of them return the same exact statement. The filter function built the array as its return value, and that's what was assigned into filtered foods. All right. Let's open it up for questions. Michael?
Is there any time where you would not want to use the arrow method?
No, it will always go ahead and utilize the arrow function. If you
Okay.
do not want to include the arrow function, you would have to make a separate function. So you could do something like const greater than 6. That takes in a number. And then what it does is if num is greater than or equal to 6, then it returns num. Right? And then instead of utilizing this filter function, you could just go ahead and pass in the function itself greater than 6.
Okay.
And I believe that will work. Oh, that didn't. I think even then I would have to pass it in with the arrow function. Nope, that completely broke it. There's a way to do it where you can just call the function inside of it. I just can't remember how to do it off the top of my head. All
Aren't
right.
you just passing the string food instead of the actual length of the number of the food?
Oh, yep. I'm just messing up, aren't I? So that does it there. Let me see if I could do it again with greater than 6 and pass by reference. Yeah, there you go. All right, so this would be another way of doing it to where you wouldn't call the filtered function, to where you wouldn't actually build the arrow function. But it's a little bit more advanced and can get confusing. So I'm gonna leave it here for notes purposes. But I am going to revert to what we had before. There you go. All right. Did that answer your question? I think that was not Carlos. Okay, Michael, I see a thumbs up. Perfect. Nick?
So since you can do everything the map and filter can do in just more lines of code, is it safe to say that these are just nice, succinct, pretty short ways to get common tasks done in less lines of code?
Yeah, we can say that safely when we're writing vanilla JavaScript. Once we are working within React and we are inside of the React framework, that we will have to depend on map and filter.
Okay.
And that's just because React is running on the latest version, whereas vanilla JavaScript can still interpret things as before. All right, Andy?
Yeah, so my question was for in the parentheses where it's the arrow function. Why isn't the output a Boolean? Because it just seems like it's food length comparing to 6. Why is it returning the actual, I guess, food?
Yeah, so what it's doing, what I'm asking this filter function to do is I'm saying I only want to build an array. So only build an array that, or where the values, excuse me, with the values that evaluate to true. So essentially what it does is it asks, hey, is the current food that I'm in the length greater than or equal to 6? If that evaluates to true, then we'll add that to our array.
Okay, so yeah, it just seems like you have to know you would if I didn't know what filter was just looking at this code, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like the return should technically be the Boolean true or false. It just seems like you have to know what filter does internally.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right, perfect.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was a little slow. So what he was saying, if instead of filter you did map on there, would that instead of returning the actual food item itself, would it return true and false?
Let's try it out. Yeah, let's try it out. So let mapped foods be equal to foods dot map, where we pass in the food and then we evaluate it. Right? We want to say, hey, is food dot length greater than or equal to 6? And let's console.log that. That would actually return the Boolean variable. Just as expected, right? Now, if we wanted to do something that was similar to filter, but not exactly the same, what we can do is write a ternary statement. This is what we were going to talk about before. I believe somebody asked earlier if there was a way that we could write it all in one line. And there is, right? I want to write an if-else statement. So I'm basically just going to say if food.length is greater than or equal to 6, then what I want to do is I want to return the food itself. Otherwise, I just want to return less, or I could even return null. And when I do this, you'll see that I get null, hot dogs, null, 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 and then yogurt. Right? I am still asking the question of if foods dot length, or excuse me, just gonna go ahead and comment this block out, is greater than or equal to 6. If so, then I want to return food. Else, I want to return null. That's all that's happening here on line 208. I pass in my if statement. It identifies it as an if statement because of that question mark on the furthest right-hand side. And then I just pass in two conditions. If true, goes on the left-hand side, and if false, goes on the right-hand side, separated by a colon. Does anyone have any questions regarding ternary statement, the filter function, or the map function? Go ahead, Carlos.
So I take it you can only do this when you have just basically one value for true. So it's no like additional if, else if, or if else. It's just either true or false, right?
If you wanted to add something else in there, you could put a secondary ternary statement in here. What you can do is you can say, so let's say that it doesn't evaluate to 6, right? Well, if I can also say if food, and I'm gonna put this in parentheses actually just to isolate it, dot length. is less than or greater than 3, then what it will do is it will return less than 6 food, and otherwise, finally, it will return no. All right, so here's my original if statement. So if it's greater than 6, since that evaluated to false, I write a secondary statement, and that's my else if, nested within one another.
And is that something commonly seen, or do you prefer? Is there a preferred method to when you have multiple statements like that? Things to check.
If you have multiple statements, don't write it in a ternary statement. It's going to get messy. I understand that sometimes we want to make things like shorthand and stuff like that, but if you're sacrificing the ability to read your code just for having shorthand, then it's not worth the squeeze. Right? Code readability is always going to take priority over shorthand.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right, perfect. If there aren't any other questions, then we are done with our map and our filter function. And now we can continue moving on into speaking about destructuring. And let me grab both of my arrays here. And let me grab my object from up above.
Passed it.
Did I pass it?
Yeah.
There. All right. So now we have our array and we have our food. Oh, excuse me. We have our array and we have our object. Now, destructuring is in reference to in case I only want to grab a few values and set them to new variables. So for example, if I wanted to say, hey, let first food be equal to foods index 0. I could do something like that. All right, and I could do let second food be equal to foods index 1. If I console.log both of these, we would expect to get pizza and hot dogs, just like we do down below, right? There's index 0 and index 1. But if I had to grab independent values over and over and over again, I would have to write this pretty consecutively again and again and again. So there's got to be a more efficient way of doing this. Well, what we also can do is we can say let first food and second food be equal to foods. And when we run this code, it's still going to return pizza and hot dogs. Well, what exactly is happening here? In this very first example, in lines 215 and line 216, I grabbed them specifically by index. And I had to establish the variable and assign that one index. Well, here, I'm not doing it as such. In here, I'm referencing the array of foods, and I'm saying for the 0 index and first index, I want you to utilize the following variables: first food and second food. So that's just the easiest way to go ahead and set variables for specific spaces. Now then the question comes, well, what if I wanted to grab something and the only thing that I needed was steak, right? That's the only thing that I want to actually grab. Maybe we call it meat. How would I go ahead and grab that? without having to spell out first food, second food, and third food. Well, what I can do is something like and let me clear these drawings here. I can pass in an underscore, and then say meat. Be equal to foods. It looks like it's not liking that. Read the code block scope variable. Oh, because I passed it twice. What happens if I do it this way? Let me see. Console.log. There you go. We would get steak. All right. I wouldn't have to actually specify variables for those previous two values. I just have to add the commas saying, hey, I want you to skip the 0 index. I want you to skip the 1 index. And for the third index, or excuse me, the 2 index, I wanted you to assign it to a variable named meat. This is just array destructuring. Does anyone have any questions over how that works? Let's hear it, Andy.
For meat, can it be replaced with anything else and it's still going to give the same result?
Yeah. So I can also change it for just X, and it will still return.
Okay, so that this is skip the first two because you didn't put anything in there. Essentially, is that what it is?
Yeah, it skipped the first two because I told it to. There was nothing in there. I told it to skip those first two indexes with those commas, and that's how I grabbed the third index.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, Alex.
If you pass it an array with just two elements, would that just be null, a null value, or
Either would actually declare it as undefined, but let's go ahead.
undefined? Okay.
Let's say foods be equal to, let's go with 1 and 2. Now, when we execute our code, we get it back as undefined. Awesome. Any other questions? Perfect. So it looks like the structuring with arrays came pretty easily to us. So let's go ahead and move into destructuring with objects. It came easy to us to destructure with arrays. It's going to be even easier to us to destructure with objects. Because with objects, we can destructure by just calling the simple keys. We can say, hey, from here, I actually want to grab the following keys. I want to grab year, color, and make. And I can just say that I want to grab that from my car object. So now if I go to console.log any one of these keys, such as year, we'll get back 2012. If I wanted to console.log something like make, we'll get back 40. Right? We're simply just grabbing the keys in curly brackets, and that's creating a variable that would match the key value pair, where the value gets set as the current value being stored in the variable. Now, the only difference between the way we destructured foods and the way we destructured car objects, when we destructure foods, it doesn't matter what you name these variables. Right? You'll see down here that we even called it X when we grab the meats portion. That's because this is destructuring by index. When it comes to an object, you're destructuring by keys. So it is extremely important that you match the variables to the corresponding key. You can't just make up something like X, because if you do that, I'm not sure if it will throw an error or return undefined, but I just know it's not going to work. So it returns undefined because it does not exist within the object. All right. Any questions regarding object destructuring? No questions. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and move on into our spread operators. All right, so for our spread operators, essentially what it does is we will generate a copy that can hold all of the previous values of foods. So for example, if I wanted to say something like let new foods be equal to, and I'm trying to just add more information into the spread operator or more information into these foods. Let's say I want to add something like, oh, come on, man, sandwich. And let's say we want to add something along the lines of, oh, I already have eggs. What else can we do here? Where's the meatballs? Why not? But I still want to hold all of the previous information. These are new foods, but I want the previous array of foods to also exist in here. Well, if I do something like foods, what's that going to do?
It's going to stick the whole array as it turned into an array within an array.
Yeah, exactly. I would have a nested array, right? I probably should console log it. Well, that's not necessarily what I want. I still want it to be one array, but I just want it to hold the previous information. I could make a for loop that would iterate through new foods and append it or push it into foods, but that's not necessarily what I want here, right? Because at this point, I'm able to write some intermediate code. So instead, I'm going to utilize a spread operator. I'm going to take apart foods and place it inside of my new foods. And now you can see there's just one array that includes sandwich and meatballs, and then has all of the previous values also belonging to that parent array. If I were to console.log foods, just like this, what we would get is a series of strings of pizza, hot dog, steak, eggs, pasta, and yogurt, no longer nested inside of an array. It's just essentially grabbing all of the values inside of that array and pulling them out of its parent data structure. So in the example 246, its parent data structure was an array. I pulled all of those values out. So now I just have strings. That applied here as well. Now I just have strings, but it just so happened that where I did it, I had another parent data structure where it was another array, making it fall within one massive array. All right. Questions, Dallas?
Can you do that with any other structure, like an object?
We're going to cover objects here shortly. Yes.
Okay.
Nick?
What happens if you put 3 more dots in front of foods, or ... foods again? A spread operator in front of the spread operator.
Let's try that.
Will it break it?
Spread it too thin.
Yeah.
Like a string of strings.
3, 1, 2, 3. Well, that's going to actually return to us a syntax error.
All right.
All right. Any other questions?
Could you try the same thing, but sticking the spread foods in an array and then another spread outside of the array?
So this foods inside of an array and then spread like
I
this.
want to see what would happen. Yeah, I want to see what would happen.
Okay, so just to clarify, we are pulling all of the strings inside of the array and placing it into an array and then pulling them out of that array again. So all we're going to get is a series of strings.
Neat.
Nice. Good job.
All right, Alex.
So along the similar lines, what if you did the spread in front of new foods? If foods was still in its array form, like so there's two strings and then an array within that array.
You're saying,
Yeah, if you just did spread in front of new foods there.
got it. Then what we would get is two strings, sandwich, meatballs, and one array without
No,
parent array.
sorry, if you did the spread in front of new foods there. So if
Yeah.
you did dot dot dot, would it just unpack everything still? Or
No. So we would get those two strings of sandwich and meatballs, but foods never got spread. So all it
So
would do.
it's like doing one layer of unpacking each time.
gotcha.
Yes, just one layer. All right. Awesome. Any other questions regarding the spread operator for arrays? Perfect. If there are no other questions regarding the spread operator for arrays, then let's move forward into the spread operator for objects. Well, let's console.log our car object and see what that returns there. Iteration symbol to be a function. Got it. So spread syntax requires iterable symbol iterator to be a function. So just tell me, hey, you can't just do this. You can't just console.log it outside of without having a parental data structure. And that's fair. If I wanted to do the spread operator, I could maybe create something new like detailed car. And maybe here I also want to include the engine size. Maybe the engine size is 4-cylinder. So let's just say 4. We could also include tire pressure, which let's say it's 37.
Fuel gas.
Yeah, let's do fuel gas.
Gas or diesel. Hydrogen.
Gas works here. Right. And now let's say we wanted to bring everything else that we already had about this car. Well, I want to include it here. I would just destructure the car object. And now when we go to console.log this detailed car, then we would get the engine, tire pressure, fuel gas, and the original object that we had before in more detail. We're essentially passing it down. We don't want it to be nested, right? I don't want there to be a new car and then show car object, because then I'd just have repeated information and an unnecessary nesting of this key. So instead, I just utilize a spread operator to get all of my information inside of one object. All right. Questions regarding the spread operator for an object? Perfect. If there are no questions regarding the spread operator for an object, then we are finally clear to go into part 3 of our lecture, where we're going to start talking about test-driven development and dive into Jest. With that said, let's go ahead and take a nice break. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back and continue on with our lecture. Currently, it's 2:40. I'll see everyone back here at 2:50 for part 3. Perfect. Welcome back, everyone, for part 3 of our lecture today. In this portion of our lecture, we're going to go ahead and break down test-driven development. What is test-driven development? Why we're utilizing Jest? we're going to go ahead and start an NPM project on our own. We'll go over how to install Jest, and then we'll go ahead and export import statements to be able to grab our actual function in a different file. And then we'll start writing some tests. And then finally, we'll end our lecture by learning how to skip tests so that we can break down and actually do some sort of isolation so that we can get good, informative feedback whenever we are writing tests. So let's start this off. Now, what is test-driven development? Test-driven development is essentially the cycle of writing tests. You will write a test. After such test is written, you're going to make that test pass. When the test is finally passing, it allows you to go back and refactor your code so that your test can continuously pass and get better. Now, if I am right, the biggest counter argument that people have for test-driven development is that I'm essentially writing code twice. I am writing code that will try to ensure that my code works. So how could that possibly be productive? Right? Because the biggest sell on test-driven development is that it saves time and that it saves money. How could that be possible? Can anybody take any stabs at that?
It goes down
Measure
to,
twice, cut once.
I was gonna say that.
Sorry.
Perfect. Can we say it again? Just
I would rather have it go a little slower and have it fail in a controlled environment than go fast and then it crash a huge system and you lose multiple billions of dollars for your client.
Perfect. Awesome. And that's exactly the concept there, right? We want to make sure that code is not going to break. And the easiest way of doing that, instead of having an entire process of, will this break? Let's push it, figure out if it breaks online. If it does break online, let's try to mimic what the client did. And hopefully we can mimic exactly the same conditions that the client had and figure out why it's breaking. And not only that, but let's say that we're making a massive application, right? Well, when we're creating features and features have to mix with one another, how can you ensure that by creating one feature, you're not crashing another one? Or that things aren't tightly coupled and dependent on one another? Well, that's where test-driven development comes in, right? As you're creating applications, as you're creating algorithms, you want to make sure that the changes that you make to your applications do not break other existing parts of your application already. And that's how it goes into saving money there. All right. I saw a hand up and then it disappeared. Just want to make sure that was addressed.
Yeah, I had a question that's probably going to be addressed as you go over it.
Okay, perfect. So now let's go ahead and dive into the actual portion of what we'll be utilizing to write our test in JavaScript. What we're going to be utilizing to write our test in JavaScript is a library called Jest. Now, Jest is very popular, and it's pretty popular with all of the newer frameworks as well. You can see that it can interact with Babel, TypeScript, Node, React, Angular, and Vue. And it's mainly utilized to write unit tests. You could also write integration tests, but it's not really recommended to do that with Jest. You could, it gives you the ability to, but I strongly recommend that you stick to unit tests in general. We will cover testing later on again whenever we're working within our frameworks, and I'll go more in depth into what unit test, integration test, and end-to-end tests are once we get to that point. For now, just keep those terminologies in the back of your head and know that we will dive deeper into these later on. So Jest is going to be our library that we'll utilize to write all of our unit tests, meaning that they should be quick and efficient tests and shouldn't interact with anything outside of our original script. Well, let's make a quick function here, and then we'll go into how install Jest and everything and get Jest set up so that it can actually run tests. So first, I'm going to create a function of add two numbers. This function will take in num1, and it'll take in num2. And all it's going to do is it's going to return the added sum of num1 plus num2. That's it. It's my entire function there. Now I want to make sure that this function is actually going to work. Well, I'm going to do that by creating a test suite for it. And this test suite is going to actually import the function and then pass in inputs into it, expect an output, and ensure that that output matches what we expect. So here we go into the installment of Jest. And before I dive too deep into the installment of Jest, a lot of the times when I cover this lecture, I get questions about the commands that I'm utilizing to install. So let me go ahead and pass this portion of the curriculum here in Avenger questions. So if you would like to take a look at the commands that I'm about to pass on the terminal to start my environment for Jest, you can go ahead and take a look at it there. Let me see if I can get a link to this. Oh, it doesn't show me a link. There you go. Perfect. That second link will take you straight to the Jest portion. So now in order to start Jest, we have to start actually working with an NPM environment. For now, we're just going to create the NPM environment strictly to handle Jest. We're not going to dive too deep into what NPM does, what NPM is just yet. We will do that during day 1 of our React week. But as of now, we're not there yet. We're just going to simply start an environment and utilize it. We'll understand why and how it works later on as we move in the cohort. So here in my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and run npm init. That's going to start a node package management environment. So here it's going to ask me, hey, what would you like to name this package? I'm going to name it my test, the version I would like to use, a description if I would like to add one. I'm not going to add any. My entry point, which I'm utilizing main.js, my test command, get repository, keywords. I'm going to go ahead and skip through the majority of this information. And this can show me a sample of what my package.json is going to be. Again, we're going to go through this later on in the cohort. For now, we're just going to simply enter and create our npm environment. Now you'll notice that once that was completed, I received a package.json. This package.json lets me install libraries that belong to JavaScript and utilize them within separate files. So now that I have an npm environment, I can utilize npm to install Jest. So I'm going to run npm --save Jest. You'll see that that's being installed here. Node modules has been created, which we'll talk about later on. A package-lock.json has been created, which essentially just keeps track of all of the dependencies that belong to this project. We're not going to touch package-lock.json, and we're not going to touch node modules ever. That's going to stay consistent moving forward. We'll go deeper into what they mean in their existence later, once we're actually working inside of our React environment. For now, I would like to concentrate on this package.json. This package.json essentially sets up our environment. At this point, this project is named my test. This is its very first version. It has no description. Its main entry point is main.js. And currently, this part of scripts is going to be for commands that I would like to run. So for example, if I run npm test right now, it's just going to echo error, no test specified, exit what. If I wanted to add something like greet, it would take shell commands such as echo hello, Avenger. And now if I run npm greet, npm greet unknown command. Oh, excuse me. npm run greet. I'll get echo Avenger, and you'll see there, hello, Avenger. This scripts portion are just commands with key value pairs that I can set up to execute within my environment. The author, that would be me. I could specify that if I would like to. Right now, that's not necessary. Have licenses if necessary. Dependencies, which currently the only dependency I have is Jest. This dependency didn't exist before. It only came into existence after I installed Jest. Because I installed Jest, it says this node package manager said, well, if I am installing Jest moving forward, if anyone needs to utilize this project, they'll need to also have Jest installed. So when they clone down this project, the node package manager or the npm environment needs to know the dependencies that belong to each individual project. And that's what's being managed here on line 12. Does anyone have any questions about what we've done up to this point?
Dependencies on Jest. Just because it was installed, it's now a dependency, or if we use it in the future, then they will need to have that installed.
The moment that you install it, it becomes a dependency.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Perfect. In that case, let's go ahead and start working into what we're actually utilize to run our test. Well, in order to run our test, what we're going to do is we're going to call Jest. So I'm going to switch this echo information here for the command of Jest. And then I'm going to write a test suite. Well, what's the difference between writing a test suite and writing a regular JavaScript file? It comes in the naming convention. I can say touch main.spec.js, or you could even name it test. And in doing so, you'll notice that it creates the file and it's in orange. Now, when I run Jest, let's look at the documentation here. Let me see if I can find a spot that talks about it. All right, I can't find an example that will talk about it within docs, so let me cover it here. All right, when I run npm jest or npm run test, what it's going to do is it's going to look within my environment. My project's environment is here. And it's going to attempt to find any file that has a URL pattern or a pattern where it ends with test.js or ts, or ends with spec.js or ts. That is what it's going to be looking for. It's even going to look for directories where the name has test inside of it. So if I have a directory with the name test in there, it's also going to look inside of that directory and find any files that have this pattern in its naming convention. That's what Jest is looking for, and that's how it can identify a test suite. So now I have my test suite finally opened up, and I could write my test. But before I write my test here, I need to actually bring in my function. So let's start talking about exporting functions now. Actually, let's do this. Just to make sure everything is working, it's console.log. Test suite is found. I believe this should run. Let's run npm run test. All right, so there you can see that Jest is working. All right, so the test suite failed to run. Your test suite must contain at least one test. So it's telling me, hey, there's no test in here. And that is correct. Currently, I haven't written any test. So this console.log was ignored because it doesn't follow the actual convention for writing test. And that's okay. We know we found it. Jest is working. Everything is connected up to this point. Now, let's start with exporting, importing, and writing our tags. In order to export this function, I'm going to write module, which refers to my entire npm module here. So this is my module. And I'm going to export. Now this module.exports expects a value. The value that I am exporting is my function of add two nums. Great. What does that mean? That means that any file within this module here can now ask for it and be able to find the function of add two nums. I've essentially made it global to my entire module. Well, how do I ask for it? In order to ask for it, what I'm going to say is I'm going to pass in const add two nums. And I'm going to make this equal to require and specify that what I'm requiring comes in from main.js.
The // means it's in the same directory.
Correct. This is the path, right? We have our relative paths like we had talked about before. So I'm saying inside of this directory, go to main JavaScript. And inside of main JavaScript, there's a function that has been exported, made global to the entire module, named add two nums. And that's how we ask for this function. So again, find main.js within current module, or let's just call it directory. Within main.js, grab exported function named add two nums. That's what's happening here in line 7. So now that it's available, I've made it so that I'm exporting from main.js and I'm importing to main.test. All right, go ahead, Andy.
When you are doing a const, you are creating another variable, add two nums. Does it have to mirror what is being exported?
Yes, it does. That's a great question. I am creating a brand new variable within the main test script, but it is looking for a match within main.js. All right, any other questions? Perfect. Let's go ahead and move forward now. Now that I have my add two nums function and everything has been imported, I can go ahead and start writing my first test. Now for my first test, I can just say it, or excuse me, I can test. I'm going to test add two nums. Will return 4 with inputs of 1 and 3. So that's what I'm going to test. And within a arrow function block, that's where I'm actually going to write my test. I am going to expect, this is just this is just going to be testing syntax. And you'll notice that my VS Code is not recognizing it. That is okay. I am going to expect add two nums, 1 and 3, to be the number of 4. Now let's run this. I'm going to run npm run test. And when I run npm run test, I get a passing test case. It tells me, hey, your test has been passing. Add two nums will return 4 with inputs of 1 and 3. And it took 2 milliseconds to execute this test. Well, this is giving me some pretty good information. It's telling me that I passed. Now, instead of having to console.log it and do it over and over again, I could just run my test suite. Well, let's see what happens if I changed my function. And my function is not meeting my requirements. Well, it tells me that it failed. And it breaks down my test a little bit for me. So it says add two nums will return 4 inputs, or 4 with inputs of 1 and 3. This time it took 3 milliseconds. It says, hey, this failed. And it failed because what was received did not match what was expected. The expected value that I wanted was 4, and what I received was -2. So this tells me that there's a problem within my function. So now I could simply go back and ensure that I turn it back into an addition, execute it at the terminal level, and now I get my passing score. Any questions about writing your very first test?
Yes. So the way you worded that, does that matter much in the test file? Is it quite a loose way that you can word it for the test to still function? I'm not sure how much of that was exactly. Expect two nums. Okay, it was still pretty codey, I guess.
Yeah, so test is definitely going to be the parent keyword there. Inside of test, you do have to have an expect and an evaluation statement. So we'll just go ahead and call this expect. And you can take a look at the different evaluation statements here in Jest. Let me go ahead and go into that. So there's to be, there's to equal, not to be. It shows you a considerable amount to be greater than of comparisons that you can utilize. And I'll share this link here as well in the Avenger questions. Right, so there's quite a bit of the evaluation, or what are they called? The matchers that you can utilize. So you will need to be followed. So expect must be followed by a matcher. All right. Does that answer your question, Dallas?
Yes, sir.
All right, perfect. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Carlos.
So is there any different, I mean, I would assume there's two different ones. Any difference between to be and to equal, I think was the other one?
There is a difference. Let me go ahead. So to equal is going to be utilized more with complex data types, and to be will be utilized for primitive data types. All right. Any other questions? Perfect. If there aren't any other questions, then let's go into writing an actual testing block. Now, for writing an actual testing block, meaning a series of tests, what we're going to do is we're going to add more to this information here. And I'm pretty sure you could also utilize it, but this works for now. Inside, well, we're going to add a parent called describe. Describe typically references the file where functions being tested live. test specifies what is actually being tested. And then we have expect, which is just the actual evaluation that determines whether a test passes or fails. So now we have describe, test, and expect. Let's break these down. We're going to add a describe block. And what this describe block is going to say is inside of main.js, we have the following. So we have a test that expects the following. I can also write a secondary test. I can test that add two nums will not work if strings are passed as input. Again, this has a body to itself. And I can expect add two nums to be one, or excuse me, to pass in string. So let's just pass in some string really quick. I can expect it not to be those two inputs put together. Well, now let's run it. Let me actually mess up my function from the very start. Let's run this minus sign. Let's run npm run test. I get two failed, right? So one test suite failed and two tests inside of this test suite failed. The test suite referencing to the file main.test.js. And it tells me two of them failed. But now I'm getting too much noise. I have all of this output in my terminal, and I don't necessarily like it because now I'm just getting lost in all of the output that's coming in within my code. So let me just silence it a little bit by isolating which test I want to run at a time. Well, how could I do that? You could just comment it out, but Jest actually provides you a way to skip it by just adding an X in front of the verbiage of test. And now when I run npm run test, it tells me, hey, there is another test here, but it's just being skipped. It knows of its existence, but it's just skipping it. Whereas if you comment it out, it will not know of its existence. So now I can take a look here. It tells me, hey, we received the following. We expected it to be 4, but what we got was -2. All right, well, let me go back here and let me go ahead and add a 2+. And when I execute my code now, it comes back with 1 passed and 1 skipped. Great. Now let me move on to that second test. I'm going to skip my first test because I know that one's passing. And I'm going to unskip my second test by just simply removing that X. When I run npm run test, this is what I get. I get a failure. Let's see what we have here. So add two nums will not work if strings are passed as input. It's not able to read, not to be. Interesting. So here it tells me there's a type error for properties undefined. And the issue's coming at where I'm saying not to be. So this is an error between, or this is an error inside of my script. This is telling me there's an error in the way I have written the test. So now I can look back over it. I see that I have dot to b, dot to equal, and I see that there's an example here saying dot not dot to b. So let's take a look. It looks like it's unable to identify it properly. Wonder, oh, and I can see why it's unable to identify it properly. If you take a look here, I made a syntax error where my expect block was never closed. So now when I close my expect block, now my test suite should work. I run npm run test one more time, and it tells me that it failed. This time it failed, not because there was an error inside of my test suite, but because there was an error inside of my actual function. So add to nums will not work if strings are passed as input. So it's expected, it received not to be expected. So expected not to work, right? And that's exactly what it returned. So now I need to actually be able to pass this test. How can I make this test pass?
Remove the not.
Without changing the test. How do I make the function pass this test?
You add an if statement to see if there's a string or to see if it's a number or not.
Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead and add that if statement. So if num1, so let's say type of num1 is equal to a string, or type of num2 is equal to a string, then I can go ahead and return no. And now let's go ahead and run our test suite. And we can see that it passed, right? Add to nums will not work if strings are passed as input. Our if statement was triggered and it returned no. And now let's actually return num1 plus num2 actually. Let's make sure that worked. Oh, still failed. And that is failing because of the way I'm doing this comparison here. All right, so here's one of the problems with JavaScript, right? How do we ensure that a number that is being passed is working correctly? Right? We are passing string here, but these aren't evaluating to true. Why could that be? How else could I test if these are string? Let's check it out. Because the thought process is there, right? We're checking the type. Let's console.log num1. Well, let's just go ahead and console.log type of num1 and execute our test suite. Okay, so it tells me that a console log came back as string. Well, interesting. This is string. So why isn't that working? Let's go ahead and take a look at this is an actual string, right? And what we're comparing it to is the class of string. So if I do something like string, what would that do? Well, now my if statement's right being triggered, right? Type of returned a string of string. So all I needed to do was change what it is that I'm checking for. And when I run my test, it's able to pass successfully. All right, go ahead, Dallas.
Can you try to explain that again for me? Because I was expecting, like how you wrote it the first time, that it matches the type and that's all it needed to check. So what am I missing?
Yeah, so type of doesn't actually return a class there. So let me go ahead and do that. Type of, and I pass in hello. This would actually not return string, as in the class of string. Instead, it would return string, letting me know, hey, this is a string. If I were to pass in type of, and I put in a bunch of numbers in there, it would not return number. Instead, it would return number.
So it returns a string.
It returns a string representing the class, not the actual class itself.
Number needs a
Sounds like
not
a
in front of it,
joke.
right?
And not. Yes, thank you. Because JavaScript.
Okay.
The lesson there is just type of returns a string that says its type. Is that correct?
Yes.
So can I test it in a different way where I actually get the class type instead of just a string telling me of the class type? Like, how could I make that work up above where you had the if statement with just string without being in a string?
I'm sure there is a way. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I can definitely
People don't use it, I guess.
say again.
But people don't use it that way? Is that what you're saying?
There is methods that make sure of that, but I don't think the most common method is going to be that. More than likely, there's something that checks if it's alphabetic or numeric within the string. Let's see. JS.
I was gonna say, could you use instance of instead of type of?
Let's
Oh,
check.
does it like that? How I'm asking, Kevin?
Yeah, I think if you use instance of, it would match with the capital string with no quotes around it.
Okay, so if I want to check if it's a number, then like he wrote down there, I would type in the if statement above in line 2 if type of num1 equals quote number end quote. That's how I'd check the type.
Yeah, so it looks like that instance of would actually work through it. So I could do something like this.
That's crazy to me.
Instance of string, and that would also still work. Yep,
Okay, thank you.
absolutely. All right. Great. So now that everything is passing, we're good to go. My test suite is working. I can go back to my test suite, unskip my test, and execute my code just to make sure that both of my tests are passing. And great, that's it. Now I know that both of my tests are passing. My code is working correctly, and I can continue developing, creating new functions that can interact with this function while ensuring that it wouldn't break. All right, Andy, go ahead.
Um, I'm kind of I thought I understood the test-driven development at first, but now it seems like this is becoming so like different. Uh, it's almost as if you are coding what you want, but in a test way. I don't understand. It is you're coding same thing twice, but it's almost as if like I don't know. I could have easily just done console log and gotten my answer faster. Is this leading up to a more complex thing?
That's correct. Yes. So just like you said, that's the biggest argument that everybody has against test-driven development. They don't understand like what, or it's hard to understand why am I doing this? I could have just figured this out with writing a couple of steps. And that is true for something as small as one function or just one script. But as we continuously develop and we start making applications, that is no longer going to be the case. And it's no longer going to be as easy to understand this is where the error is coming from. And that's why we need to make sure that we have test-driven development implemented from the very start, right? So for now, it looks like it's useless almost because of the simplicity of it. But as we continuously progress and tests start getting more and more complicated, we're already so used to seeing test-driven development that it's going to become natural to adapt and continue common practices when we have larger projects that we're working in. Does that answer your question, Andy? Perfect. Keegan?
So say you have multiple functions in one file. Would you just export it as a list? How would that work?
Yeah, let's take a look at that. All right. If I wanted to also add that function, well, I can go ahead and I would pass it as an object of say hello. And then that way, in main.test.py, I would actually grab it like this. If I go to run my test, everything still works. And if I wanted to grab that other one of say hello, I would also call it as such.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Say, I have a question.
Yes.
Say you have more files that you're trying to test, but in your package you only do you set another script to run other files? Because you just run npm run test. So like if you had more than one file to test, how do you differentiate which file?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can actually do that by specifying which file it is that you want to test. So you can run npm run test and then specify, hey, the test that I want to utilize is main.test.js. And it would
Okay.
identify that one test suite. So you can see here, it's specified the one test suite that we are testing is main.test.js. If I had a separate file, let's say touch dummy.test.js. Now there's two test suites. If I just run npm run test, one of them is going to pass and the other one is going to fail. And the one that fails because there's no test suites or there's no test inside of the set test suite. It tells me, hey, you must have at least one to be able to pass. So let's isolate it, right? I only want to test the one. So I'm going to npm run test main.test.js. And by doing so, I don't get a failure message. It only grabbed the one test suite that I wanted and ran the test against it. Does that answer your question? I lost you. Was that Cody? I think that was Cody.
Yeah, sorry, I muted. Yeah. So you just specify at the end of the run test which file.
Perfect. Carlos?
So with that same train of thought, if you can specify the file name itself, can you specify the directory and just kind of test all the files that are in there?
Yes, you can. You can also specify directories. So let's see, let's test it out. Here, test 1. And here, test 2. Let's move main test.js into test 1. And let's move dummy test into test. All right. So again, if I run npm run test, it's going to dive into both of those directories. So one of them failed because of the path. So I need to make sure that I clarify my path now. Let's go into test 1. Need to go back a directory and grab it from main.js. Perfect. So as expected, just like before, only one of them would fail. I can specify, hey, I want to npm run test only inside of test 1. And it's able to isolate said directories to find all of the tests. Does that answer your question, Carlos?
So, yes, sir, it is.
Perfect. Any other questions? All right. If there are no other questions, this is where we are going to conclude our lecture for today. It is finally over. Let me go ahead and stop our recording here, everybody.